Hi guys, this is Hirosaki. This story is all about what if Naruto was entrusted with a legendary gift. When Naruto is given a gift considered legendary even in a world where walking on water is a daily occurrence for some, will it lead him on a path towards peace, or will the consequences of said gift leave a hole in his heart too large to fill? Before we start, kindly like and subscribe to this channel, and look over the description box for the author of this amazing storyline. Welcome aboard. Chapter 25, Water Eye. It was a relatively normal day in the northern region of Mizu no Kuni, so naturally it was raining, the mists were heavy, and visibility was low. Two shinobi were out patrolling the coast, their worn headbands clearly marking them as Kirigakure ninja. Of course, nowadays in Mizu no Kuni that can mean one of two things, loyalists or rebels. Unlike in Aim no Kuni, it was very well known that a civil war had broken out in Kirigakure ever since the Yondaime Mizukage, Yugura, had declared war on bloodline users. It was a bloody time for residents in the Land of Water, with entire clans of Kekii Genkai users going extinct overnight under the orders of Kiri's Kage. Of course, these people were human, so they didn't take it lying down. Naturally, a rebellion arose against the current regime, with many bloodline clans banding together against the purists under Yugura's iron control. In this time of war and bloodshed, the once peaceful, if not secluded, Mizu no Kuni had gained a new moniker, the Bloody Mist. Come on Kenji, get off your ass and stop lazing around. One of the shinobi, a lanky man with limp brown hair covered by a loose-fitting blue bandana, was currently waiting for his companion to get up from where he was lounging against the base of a large tree. Calm down Shiroko, it's not like we're in any rush. The man on the ground had a decidedly more laid-back attitude than his more uptight comrade, as evidenced by his slack posture and lidded eyes. He was casually chewing on a senbon, a favored weapon of the Kiri hunter Nin, both past and present. Yeah, we have to complete our patrol and report into Shima Taishu in 10 minutes. The man on the floor just groaned as he lurched to his feet, swaying slightly with his arms hanging limply in front of him. Fine, I don't get why we're even patrolling here, nothing ever happens this far north. Everybody knows all the real fighting happens in the contested zones on the main island. Shiroko's eyebrow nearly twitched in irritation as he began to walk off, caring less and less if his lazy compatriot was actually following. You know perfectly well why we're here, it's because you were idiotic enough to make all those inappropriate comments about Maesama. Kenji just chuckled into his long sleeve as he languidly followed after his rigid friend. Oh yeah, that was pretty funny. I swear Aos I was gonna pop out or something when he overheard. Because of the mist, Kenji missed his companion's face turn an increasingly virulent shade of red. It wasn't funny, we could have been on lockdown for a few weeks for what you said. We're lucky to just be stuck on guard duty up here. Kenji merely waved a lazy hand in Shiroko's general direction, more out of acknowledgement than any kind of apology. You worry too much, at least it's quiet up here. The reports from down south are getting pretty bloody lately. Shiroko merely sighed, adjusting his bandana slightly and tucking a few strands of hair underneath the cloth. Yeah, I guess you're right about dash. Both shinobi were suddenly interrupted as they heard a faint, but increasingly loud whistling sound approaching their position. While Kenji might have been lazy and rude and incompetent at times, he was still a trained shinobi and recognized what that sound could mean. Both sets of eyes turned towards the stretch of coast they were nearest to see a black spot in the sky, barreling towards them at astonishing speeds. Incoming! Kenji and Shiroko both took cover behind a set of palm trees, keeping an eye on the shore and the incoming projectile. However, both could only raise an eye when whatever it was drew closer, eliciting another sound. Yahoho! As enormous crash followed as whatever it was smashed right into the water at the shore, creating an enormous splash that nearly reached the two hidden men. When the water finally settled, both were astonished to see what appeared to be a young boy in his early teens crouched in a three-point stance on the water's surface. If it weren't for his unusual arrival in Mizu no Kuni, the two might have mistaken him for a monk. He was wearing the traditional robes and carried a shikoju. The only thing that marked him as any different was the archaic headband on his forehead, the type that hadn't been worn for centuries. Kochios. As if only to surprise the two even more, the boy immediately slammed his hand down on the water, a sealing matrix quickly spreading out from his palm. Once the resulting veil of smoke lifted, the rebel shinobi could see two girls, one with purple hair dressed as a Miko, the other with green hair and more revealing white clothing. The violet looked decidedly ill from the rather unorthodox method of travel, while the verdette merely straightened up, glancing around their new surroundings. The two Kiri shinobi shared a quick look before nodding to one another and dashing off. Their captain had to be informed of something like this. "Erg, I don't feel too good." Naruto just gave Shizuku a sympathetic pat on the back as the girl leaned heavily on a nearby tree. She sent a scathing look at Fu, who didn't even seem fazed by the summoning. In fact, she was scouting the area in case of dangerous shinobi or bandits. "How come she's okay?" Naruto just shrugged, careful not to remove his hand from Shizuku's back where he was making light, soothing circles which seemed to be helping. "It must be like motion sickness, it just affects some worse than others." Shizuku nodded meekly. She didn't seem all that pleased about it. Her rather green-tinted face said that much. "I just still can't believe you made it all the way across in a day." Naruto just grinned happily. It had taken substantial effort and a brief stop at a small island he had passed, but he had managed to cross the sea separating Kaminari no Kuni and the northern islands of Mizu no Kuni. Mostly he had just used his gravity manipulation to make himself lighter and bounded across the open water. It wasn't quite striding, but he figured it was close enough. However, even he wasn't completely immune to chakra exhaustion. "Naruto? Naruto!" Shizuku managed to catch the blonde as he suddenly wilted on his feet, swaying like a sickly plant before simply slumping to his side, completely worn out. Fu quickly jogged back over after hearing her friend's cries, only to see a blissfully sleeping blonde in Shizuku's arms. A small smirk crossed the caramel-skinned girl's features as she helped her friend get the blonde up onto his feet. "He really overdid himself this time, didn't he?" Shizuku nodded with a warm smile. She was still feeling a little ill from the impromptu transport, but she had to admit what Naruto did was reckless, even for the container of 3 bijou. "But I don't know what he would be like if he didn't do stuff like this." Even Fu had to smile at that as she quickly pulled Naruto onto her back, his limp head lolling comically over her shoulder. Shizuku looked a little jealous that Fu was the one carrying Naruto, but she knew Fu was both stronger than her and had greater stamina. "We should find a town so he can recuperate." Shizuku shook her head to clear away her green-tinged thoughts with a smile before nodding in agreement, only having half heard what her friend had said. A light groaning announced Naruto's reawakening to the world, or more specifically the little brown-haired girl who was staring at him not 3 inches from his face. She also happened to be sitting directly on Naruto's chest, a fact he noticed through his suddenly labored breathing. They just stared at one another for a few moments, Naruto with an expressionless face, and the girl with one of odd curiosity that only children can pull off well. "You have funny eyes." Naruto let a small smile spread over his face, stretching out the whisker marks on his cheeks, much to the little girl's amusement. "Thank you. I take pride in my eyes bringing amusement to others." The girl just cocked her head slightly, trying to figure out what Naruto meant by that, and if he was being serious or sarcastic. Then again, very few 3-year-olds have a solid grasp on sarcasm. In the end, she simply giggled into her hand as she got up off of Naruto's chest and ran from the room with quick, pattering steps. Naruto raised himself onto his arms with an amused expression before looking around to try and see where he was. It was a small but warm room with a very family feel, with its cozy red walls and simple, but well-used furniture. There were a few pictures on the wall of a family, the little girl featured in most of them, as well as 2 adults who were most likely her parents given the similar hair color of the woman and eyes of the man. He sat up and stretched his neck as he quickly removed the blanket that had been laid over him, panicking slightly when he realized his clothes and possessions were missing. He relaxed though when he spotted them over on a nearby chair, his shikuju leant up against it. "I hope tonight didn't disturb your sleep." Naruto looked up just as he pulled on the last of his clothes, his robe-like shirt, to see the woman that featured in most of the pictures. He just gave a kindly smile, allowing his features to set into his well-practiced serene expression. Of course not, she was merely curious. The woman chuckled in a light tinkling tone with a knowing nod. She herself was like an older version of the little girl with the same long brown hair and kindly heart-shaped face. She had a few wrinkles and worry lines, but her eyes held plenty of youth and energy. "May I ask where I am?" Quickly nodding, the woman motioned for the blonde to follow her out of the room. "I'm Minowa, your friends brought you here to our village saying you had fallen unconscious from exhaustion. I let you sleep in the spare room." Naruto just nodded politely. "They are in the kitchen waiting for you." The blonde followed the woman through the small house. It only seemed to have one floor, and it only took them a moment to reach the cozy kitchen area. Fu was sitting in a chair to one side, flipping through a book from the countless she had stored away in a scroll, while Shizuku was at the table making funny faces for Tanai. However, she immediately looked up as Naruto walked in, her eyes widening as Naruto braced himself. "Naruto-kun." Not one to be caught out twice, Naruto actually managed to catch the girl this time instead of being bowled over, holding her secure in his arms as she hugged her. Fu looked up over the edge of her book, her eyes narrowing slightly as a feeling ran through her chest that she didn't recognize. Once again she wondered if she was coming down with something. Then again, she was a Jinchuriki, she had never been sick in her life before, her advanced healing took care of them too quickly. "Morning, Shizuku." The blushing girl quietly got off of Naruto, suddenly realizing how that might have looked to the others in the room. Sure enough, Fu had gone back to her book, however there was a faint red on her cheeks and Minowa was quietly giggling into her sleeve like a schoolgirl. Naruto quickly turned to the woman and bowed his head slightly, not in deference, but in respect. "Thank you for your hospitality, Minowa-san. Is there anything I can do to repay you before we leave?" The brown-haired woman frowned slightly at that, saddened that the people who had gotten on so well with Tanai were already leaving. "Must you go so soon?" Naruto just nodded with a slightly sad smile. He didn't know the woman, but she seemed kind for letting complete strangers into her home. "Yes, we're going to Kiri, so it would be better to get moving in the early hours of the day before the mists get too thick." The mists of Mizu no Kuni were somewhat of a legend, they never truly dissipated. The country was always shrouded by at least a light fog, much like how Amagakure was always experiencing some degree of rainfall. At worst, the fog could make it almost impossible for you to see even your own hand in front of your face. They tended to get worse as the day went on, so traveling in the mornings was fairly common. Minowa on the other hand just gained a look of alarm as her eyes widened. The two girls had not told her their destination. "Kiri? You're going to Kirigakure no Sato?" Naruto just nodded, slightly confused by the woman's startled reaction. "But you can't. The civil war is worst between here and there." She looked sadly across the room to another portrait of the happy family trio, all grinning at whoever was taking the photo. "Many people are fighting and dying out there right now. And not just those fighting, those caught in the crossfires are dying too." She looked up, surprised to feel a warm hand clasp her shoulder, to see Naruto smiling at her softly. "Don't worry about us, we're a tough group." He nodded politely again, leaving a few ryo, the equivalent for a stay in a nice inn, on the table as he made for the door. "Again, I thank you for the warm bed." With that he waved before ducking under the flaps that acted like the door, Fu and Shizuku quickly following him out into the street after saying their own goodbyes. Tanai rushed out after them, slightly saddened to see the funny people leaving, but waving with a grin on her face all the same. "Bye, Mr. Funny Eyes. Bye-bye, nice ladies." The trio smiled at the little girl as they walked off, Minowa coming out a moment later to usher her daughter back inside. Soon they were walking down the street of the village they were in, getting the occasional nod from a townsman that passed them in the opposite direction. Naruto just looked around with a genuine smile. The village seemed peaceful and happy, nothing like Mizu no Kuni had been described to him by one of the monks who had tried to provide aid there. His name was Motoko, an elderly monk who had been with the Fire Temple for all of his adult life since running away from his home as a teenager. He had gone out to Mizu no Kuni when word of the civil war had reached the mainland, of course, with Kiri being the isolationists they were that could have been anything from a month to a year after the war actually started. He had come back with tales of how rundown and desperate the population was with thieving children and beggars on street corners. In the end he had been forced to leave the country after numerous threats from Kiri loyalist ninja, who didn't appreciate him aiding the supposed bloodline lovers. Then again, they were currently in the territory that was more or less completely in the control of the rebels, namely the northern islands and about a quarter of the main island. Beyond that it was miles of contested territory, the territory borders being moved on an almost daily basis as counterattack after attack was launched between the two sides vying for control. So far, the conflict had not reached Kiri itself, but from what he knew the rebels were slowly but surely pushing south, claiming more and more land. So where are we going now? Are we really going to Kirigakure? Naruto just nodded as they walked, the group having already made it outside of the village and into a thickly forested area that would be difficult to traverse once the mist really came in. But why? What about the war? Naruto sighed but didn't stop moving, deftly stepping over various roots that would have tripped a civilian. Because that is where we can provide the most aid. Fu nodded from behind him. She had a chance to talk with Minowa, and had gotten a fairly good idea of what it was like in the contested areas. Plus, we need to go somewhere to train mine and your water affinities. Shizuka nodded slowly with a large frown. From everything she had heard she didn't particularly like the sound of Kirigakure. She agreed more with the rebels. Couldn't we go to the rebels instead? I'm sure they could help us just as well. It's not like there is much we could do anyway, we're only 3 people, and this war is countrywide. Naruto stopped for a moment, shifting his weight to lean against his staff as he looked around at her with a kindly smile. His eyes were open, a rarity even when it was just the 3 of them, and they had a deep sense of pain about them. It doesn't matter how much we can help Shizuku, just that we do something. With that he started walking again, the soft jingle of his shakuja strangely reassuring to the Violet. Anyway, I want to try something soon. If I can get it right then I think we could help more than you'd expect. Plus, the rebels are already too busy to help us train before their own shinobi. I wouldn't ask for their valuable time anyway, their goal is too important. Shizuku was genuinely surprised at that. She had thought Naruto abhorred all kinds of violence, yet he had just admitted to agreeing with the rebels' point of view. They stayed quiet for a while as they walked. The pounding rain was affecting them more than it usually did. After so long in Kumo with relatively clear days for their entire stay, it was rather depressing for Shizuku to once again be subjected to her curse. It didn't help that as the day slowly dragged on, and then moved further and further south, the mist seemed to only thicken and get worse. Soon it was to the point where even Naruto's Rinnegan was struggling to see more than 10 feet in front of them. That was dangerous. An ambush you couldn't see coming was the most likely to be successful, and in a run-down and impoverished country like Mizu no Kuni, especially as they approached the contested areas, bandits were highly likely. That wasn't to say Naruto doubted his ability to defend them should the need arise, but it was likely there was more than just bandits out in the mist. Soon it became too much for them, and the trio settled in the next clearing they stumbled across, quite literally in Shizuku's case as she tripped over a jutting root. Once Naruto finished setting up their rudimentary camp, which meant putting up a sand barrier around the clearing as well as sending out his chakra through the ground as an early warning system, they each went about their own business. Fu retired to a corner off the hut and began to read. It worried Naruto a little. She seemed to be becoming more closed off to the world, even around him and Shizuku. Shizuku played with Masaru for a bit while also seeing if she could perform her water exercises on the moist ground, with somewhat limited success. She got bored after a while though and moved over to where Fu was reading, peering over the girl's shoulder to try and see what she was reading. Fu reacted like any normal person did in that situation. She shied away from the girl and moved her book so that Shizuku couldn't see it. The Violet merely pouted as she took up her little exercise again. Suddenly she blinked, looking down at the small tower of water she had created. "Hey Fu." The girl didn't move her orange eyes from the book, but Shizuka somehow knew she was listening. "What's your affinity?" At that the girl paused, licked her finger and marked the page she was on by folding the corner of the page. I have a main affinity to water and secondary one to wind. Shizuku nodded. That had been bugging her for a while, but for some reason she had just never asked. Another thought suddenly struck her as she grinned at Fu, motioning to her little tower of moisture collected between her palm and the ground. So does that mean I'm farther on in the elemental manipulation than you are? Fu just blinked disinterestedly as she picked up her book again. No, I completed the second stage of both water and wind manipulation when I was 10 years old. Shizuku just frowned dejectedly. She thought she finally had something she was better at than Fu. Suddenly her head shot up, confusion evident across her scrunched-up features. Hey, then why haven't you told me what the second stage was after all this time? Fu simply looked up once from the book, her face blank and expressionless. You never asked. Before Shizuku could retort, Naruto caught both girls' attention as he sat down across the sand hut from them. Instead of sitting down and meditating lightly like he had done every evening since he was 8 years old, he instead created a single chakra rod and stared at it intently. Fu actually glanced up from the book she was skimming through, her thin eyebrows quirked in curiosity. Likewise, Shizuku looked over, her control over the very small pillar she had made quickly breaking as it splashed to the ground. What are you doing, Naruto? The blonde didn't look up, his eyes was firmly set on the thin black bar sitting on the ground in front of it. From the way he was just staring at the chakra rod, you would half expect it to simply combust from the intensity of his gaze. He took a deep breath as he picked the bar up, gently crushing it in his hand, and allowing the dust to settle in his palm. He closed his eyes, but you could still see the deep concentration on his face as he slowly closed his hand over the dust. Hopefully. His hand clenched even harder as his face tightened in concentration, beads of sweat gathering at his brow. Something. The hand holding the chakra dust was now shaking slightly as Naruto clenched his teeth. If any of them could see his chakra, they would have known enormous amounts had gathered in his palm, enough to act like a beacon to a Byakugan user. Impossible. Spontaneously his right hand erupted in blue flame, pouring out between his fingers like it was trying to escape his grasp. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, he stopped, letting out a long and relieved breath as he opened his eyes and wiped away the sweat on his forehead. Tentatively he opened his hand, grinning slightly as he tossed something up into the air, something that had not been there before. He caught it again deftly, blowing off the dark layer of black powder around it to reveal glinting gold underneath. Shizuku and Fu's jaws nearly dropped at the sight of a single Ryo coin, the simple gold disc with the square hole through, though the middle was unmistakable. Naruto just looked around, smiling at his friend's shocked reactions. They were just too priceless. What was that? Naruto just grinned and tapped the side of his nose cheekily. Fu on the other hand walked over, quickly grabbing the golden Ryo from his hand and checking it over. She felt its weight, cast a keen eye over its size and shape and even bit it slightly to check if it was really gold. It was common practice for shinobi to be able to tell the difference between real and fake money, because sometimes the customers were as sneaky as the ninja they hired. She looked down at it in her palm, her eyes wide and disbelieving, nearly dropping the phantom coin like it would just combust in her hand. It's real. Naruto just kept grinning, although inwardly he was slightly tired from just that small use of the jutsu he had half expected not to work. Fu looked down at him, eyes narrowed and coin held in front of her, almost accusingly. How did you do that? Naruto stopped grinning, he figured he had played with his friends long enough. The sage created the bijou from the chakra of the Jubi. I think in comparison a small gold coin is slightly more doable. Fu just blinked. Naruto had told her of the Kyuubi's brief mention of the sage's ability that allowed him to create life itself. You are trying to recreate the Banbutsu Suzu? The blonde just gave a knowing smile as he stood up, stretching his back out. He hadn't been sitting for very long, but it had felt as though he had been in that position for hours, and all he had created was one golden coin. How does it work? At that the blonde just chuckled sheepishly, absently creating another chakra rod and spinning it lazily between his fingers. Now that I couldn't tell you because I have no idea. He sighed wearily, allowing the simple rod to disintegrate in his grasp, reabsorbing the chakra he had used to create it. I did it more off a hunch than anything else. The QB called the rods a cheap imitation, so I figured I would start from there. Instead of trying to create something other than them from nothing but chakra, I would try to convert the rod into something else. The gold coin was just the first thing that came to mind that I could easily visualize. Fo nodded thoughtfully, still staring at the little piece of metal that minutes ago hadn't existed, at least in this form. So, in theory, you could create anything you visualized? Naruto shrugged, like he said he had been operating off of a hunch he knew just as much as she did. I guess, if I had the chakra. He looked down, frowning slightly as he plucked the coin out of the verdette's hand, looking at it strangely. But you know, it's weird. In one way I feel as though I've used up loads of my chakra, yet at the same time I feel almost exactly the same as I did before. I don't really know how to explain the feeling. He suddenly looked up, clicking his fingers once as he absently flipped the coin up, the flash of metal catching both Fo and Shizuka's attention. Actually, do you remember when you first started drawing out chakra? Fo nodded slowly. It was a long time ago, but it was the kind of memory you kept with you as a shinobi. It's almost like when you first start to mold chakra, but you get the balance between spiritual and physical wrong. You end up messing it up and expelling the chakra anyway, but you used up more physical energy than spiritual, or the other way around. He nodded once, seemingly satisfied with that explanation, before quickly adding. But not quite like that, similar though. Shizuku had been nodding along to this through the whole conversation and Masaru had been parroting the motion comically. I'm lost. Naruto turned to Shizuku and just shrugged helplessly. That was the best way he could find to explain it. Fo took the coin back. It was strangely warm and for some reason she felt inherently safe while holding it. It was strange because she had never been all that concerned with money before in her life. Then again, she had never held a coin that had been created from pure chakra before either. Well, I guess we're set for money now. Naruto just raised an eye at the purple-haired girl as he took the coin back, closed his hand around it and concentrated for a moment. When he opened it again, nothing but a fine black powder poured out. He didn't miss the disappointed looks from Fo and Shizuku, although in Fo's case it was for a different reason. That would be highly misappropriate, don't you think? It's basically fraud. Shizuku merely pointed at the blonde accusingly. You were the one who made it in the first place. Naruto just motioned to the now dissolving black powder on the damp floor, causing Shizuku to pout cutely. Well, either way it's not fraud. Fo said it was real money. Naruto just shook his head and sat back down. This strange tiredness yet not tiredness he was feeling was disorientating. I'm not going to just create money to make our lives easier, it's irresponsible. Shizuku frowned at the ground, not noticing Masaru sending confused glances around the room, wondering what was going on with the strange large monkeys he had been following. Then how are you going to use this to help people like you said you would? Naruto just smiled sagely as he leant against his own wall of sand, noting absently that the mist didn't seem to be affecting it as long as his chakra was in it. Money is not the answer to all problems, Shizuku. Now if you don't mind. He yawned into his hand and curled up slightly on his sleeping mat, his eyes slowly drifting shut. I'm going to sleep. Fo and Shizuku just stared at the napping blonde for a moment before both their eyes drifted to the small pile of black dust that had just finished dissolving into bright golden sparkles that slowly faded from view. Chapter 26, Water 2. Hey, I think I'm getting better at this. The trio were once again moving through the thickly packed forests of Mizu no Kuni, the early morning sun helping to burn off the light mist hanging over the group. Fo was walking ahead, using her chakra-heightened senses to pick out the best path south, because the map was no help at all. Naruto was walking slower than usual, but he was still helping. His chakra was spreading out through the ground as they moved to warn him of anybody approaching. However, most of his attention was on his hand, which was currently lit with an ethereal blue flame. He had been working on his control over what he thought to be Banbutsu Suzu, refining how much chakra it took to create certain items. He had at first just kept creating coins as they had a simple design, and were easy to visualize. However, Shizuka kept looking at them, so he tried other things. Every time he opened his hand, a new object would appear, sometimes a little warped, but always recognizable. He still had that strange feeling of unbalance after performing the technique, and was trying to figure out what it was, and hopefully how to fix it. "That's great, Naruto." Shizuka's deadpan voice was slightly muffled by the mist in the air, but it reached Naruto and Fu's ears just fine. Normally she would be more enthusiastic about what Naruto was doing. It didn't help though that he had been constantly talking about it all morning. It was also very distracting every time his hand would ignite in flame to announce he was using the technique again. Fu's danger senses would flare and Shizuka would become slightly uneasy at the massive chakra usage. "No, really, say something and I'll make it." Despite his friend's obvious annoyance at him, Naruto's mood just couldn't be dampened. Apart from the weird feeling he got from using the technique, he was excited to be able to do such a unique and powerful technique, at least when he got it right. Shizuka just sighed while Fu gained a small smirk as she deftly navigated through the trees around them. Shizuka was about to suggest something really hard just so Naruto would focus on it for a while and give them some quiet when her rumbling stomach cut through the silence. "Some food it is." Naruto's snicker at Shizuka's growling stomach was poorly concealed, even when she shot him a half-annoyed, half-embarrassed look. He just grinned at her in a fox-like manner as he closed his hand again, the small senbon he had created quickly dissolving into the recognizable black powder he was working with right now. A look of intense concentration overcame him as he channeled an enormous amount of chakra into his hand, igniting it in cerulean flames. They had worked out that one instance of Naruto using this technique used more chakra than Shizuka's entire capacity. There. The flames died down, and when Naruto opened his hand it revealed a small loaf of bread which almost seemed to grow out of his palm to a more filling size. He grinned as Shizuka just looked at it with longing eyes, her stomach once again announcing her hunger loudly. She quickly took it, biting into it with a blissful expression. They had provisions, but they tended not to eat outside of mealtimes to preserve their food. Erg. Shizuka's cheeks suddenly bulged as she nearly heaved up the small bite of bread she had eaten, her face turning a rather virulent shade of green. She dropped the rest, staring at it in disgust while Fu and Naruto merely sweat-dropped at the exaggerated reaction. The blonde quickly caught the bread before it hit the floor, staring at it and Shizuka with a raised eyebrow. "Come on, it can't be that bad." Shizuka's only response was to turn and retch into her hand again, the shade of green darkening slightly. The monk tentatively sniffed the unassuming loaf. It just smelt like any normal piece of bread, it was even slightly warm. He took a testing bite only to immediately spit it out, retching almost as loudly as Shizuka, much to Fu's amusement. The bread was terrible, it was like eating wet sand, gritty and slightly damp. He never thought anything could taste so disgusting. When the two finally recovered, Naruto crushed the bread back into chakra dust, staring at his hand incredulously. "I don't get it, I must be doing something wrong." Shizuka just glared at him. Her face hadn't quite lost its pallid tinge, and she still felt like throwing up. At least Naruto hadn't actually swallowed the abomination he called bread. "Maybe you just can't cook." Fu smirked at that. She always found these little interactions between Naruto and Shizuka amusing, at least when they didn't get too close, although she wasn't sure why. "I so can cook, loads of the monks liked my food." Shizuka just raised a disbelieving eyebrow at him. She wondered if the monks were all tasteless, or they were simply humoring the blonde. Naruto just growled as a new chakra rod shot from his sleeves, quickly dissolving into the miraculous dust. "I'll show you, it must just need more chakra." At that Fu stepped in. She had noticed the beads of sweat building up on Naruto's brow for the last few minutes. "Are you sure that's wise? You've been at this for the last hour, perhaps you should regain your energy first." Naruto just waved her off, already focusing intently on his hand. "I'll be fine, I've got energy to spare. Plus, I can regain my energy with the delicious bread I'm about to make." Fu just sighed and shrugged, stepping back to allow Naruto to try again. "Fine, but I'm not carrying you if you faint." She just got another dismissive hand wave as Naruto channeled even more chakra to his hand. This time he didn't just picture the bread, he remembered how it tasted, how it smelled, even how it sounded, the slight crackling of freshly baked goods titillating his memory's ear. With his hand shaking under the strain, and an even brighter blue flame threatening to spill out of his hand, Naruto practically bored a hole in his hand from staring at it so intently. Ha! Naruto looked down at the new loaf of bread he had created. It looked exactly the same as the first, if not slightly more golden. I did dash, and promptly fainted backwards. Shizuka rushed over, her irritation almost instantly being replaced by worry as she quickly checked the blonde over. When she found he was fine, and had simply overexerted himself, she had to refrain from slapping him over the head, not that it would do much good with him being unconscious. Fu on the other hand just sighed with a small eye roll as she walked over, pulling something out of her pouch. "What are you doing?" Shizuka looked up with caution at the small glass bottle in Fu's hand. It seemed to be filled with some kind of dark green herb, all crushed up into a paste. Fu just knelt down, holding the bottle up in front of Naruto's nose. "I told him I was not carrying him to the next village this time." As soon as she finished speaking, Naruto's eyes shot open wider than most would believe possible, considering he always had them squinted or narrowed. He nearly shot backwards in surprise. Instead, scrabbling back on all fours, he accidentally kicked the small loaf of bread right at Fu, who caught it easily. "Gah! What the heck is that? It smells awful." Fu just smiled a little too innocently as she replaced the lid on the bottle and safely tucked it away in her pouch. "Just a small gift from Minowa in case you fell unconscious again." Naruto's eyes just kept darting to her pouch and back, his face slowly regaining color. It was almost the second time in an hour that he wanted to retch. The smell was even worse than the first piece of bread he had made. "We should get going now." Naruto just nodded immediately. He didn't trust the all-too-kind smile on Fu's usually expressionless face. It was just creepy. The trio quickly made their way in silence, this time with Naruto leading as he was too tired for the Banbutsu Suzu right now. Fu brought up the rear, looking down curiously at the bread in her hand. It looked okay, and she had eaten some pretty nasty things during her time. In the end she just shrugged and took a bite anyway. Her stomach might not have been growling, but she was still rather hungry. Her face immediately lit up as she smiled reflexively. The bread was warm, crunchy, and most importantly, delicious. Their trip went on in rather awkward silence until they came across another town. The mists had been rather forgiving today, so they decided to just walk right through and keep going. They were beginning to enter the more contested regions of Mizu no Kuni, and they didn't want to get pulled into anything. However, for as long as they had traveled with Naruto, they should have known things were never going to be that simple. The village was very different to that of Minowa's further north. For one thing, the shinobi presence was much greater, or at least more noticeable. It was beginning to look more like how Mizu no Kuni had been described to him, destitute and hopeless. There was a general air of defeat and hopelessness in the air. The residents' movements were sluggish and lacking true purpose or energy. There were even a few people on the sides of the street, their skin pale and their bodies thin and malnourished. It was a heart-wrenching scene to see kids in alleyway, their clothes hanging off their almost skeletal frames, obviously having not seen a good meal in days. It was a good thing most villages and towns in Mizu no Kuni always had a fresh running water source, or there might be many more non-combatant casualties in this civil war. Unfortunately, if Naruto started handing out what little provisions they probably wouldn't have enough food to make it anywhere near Kirigakure. As they were walking down what appeared to be the main street, lined with what few shops were still open for business, they passed a small group of kids. One of them, a small scruffy girl with dirty brown hair wearing a worn blue dress, bumped into Naruto before apologizing in a small timid voice and running off to catch up with her friends. Naruto just smiled sadly at the scene before frowning as he patted where his money pouch was supposed to be. "Hey!" He turned, only to see the group of kids sprinting off into nearby alleyway. He chased after them, his longer legs and chakra-enhanced movement allowing him to round the corner of the narrow alley only a few seconds later. However, as soon as he stepped foot on the wet cobbles, a makeshift smoke bomb went off at his feet, causing him to cough as he breathed some in. However, it didn't blind him like it was supposed to. He could clearly see the chakra of the kids as they ran off. Ban's Ho Ten In. He held out a hand, aiming for the little girl who had bumped into him. By the time the smoke had cleared, he had a strong grip on her shoulder as she stared up at him with wide, fearful gray eyes. She cowered slightly under his stern look that quickly softened when he saw just how scared she was. "Please don't hurt me, I'm sorry." She held out the pouch in front of her, her hand trembling a little at the thought of the rebuking she would receive. She had heard of kids getting caught after stealing from people trained in chakra before, especially shinobi. It was enough to say that Kiri loyalists weren't the most forgiving people, and it was very easy to be falsely branded as having a bloodline if you weren't careful. "Look, I'm not going to hurt you." Naruto got down on one knee and smiled as warmly as he could at the little girl, opening eyes so he would appear less threatening. Unfortunately, this had the opposite effect from what he was going for. The girl took one look at his unusual eyes and screamed. "You have a bloodline." Naruto was so shocked by the sudden outburst that he didn't resist when she pulled herself out of his now loosened grip and sprinted off, her breath coming out in fearful gasps. Naruto just knelt there, shocked by the little girl's terrified reaction at his eyes. He quickly shook himself out of his shock as he stood, pulling his cloak around himself tighter and swiftly walking out of the alley. His eyes glanced around for any shinobi that might have heard the outburst. Luckily, there didn't appear to be any nearby. A few moments later, and he had rejoined Fu and Shizuku, continuing on down the street until they were out of the village. All the way Shizuku had been looking at him strangely while Fu was her usual impassive self. However, even through the green-haired girl's expressionless facade there were signs of sadness and pity for the people around her. She couldn't help but compare their situation to hers before Naruto came along, and she wondered if they would have somebody to save them as well. "What?" Naruto finally broke the tense silence hanging around the group as he turned to look at Shizuku, who simply tilted her head. "Do you still believe it would be irresponsible to create money?" Naruto just blinked in surprise at the question before firmly nodding. "Of course. You shouldn't abuse a power selfishly like that. Anyway, we have enough money to get from place to place." Shizuku just shook her head stubbornly, a frown marring her usually carefree features. "Not for us, for them." She motioned behind her in the general direction of the town they had passed through. "Don't you think we could help them? Give them enough money to at least buy food?" Before Naruto could answer, Fu cut in, her usual monotone voice bouncing slightly in the fog. "It would be pointless." Shizuku just looked at Fu, a horrified and disbelieving look on her face. "How could you say that, Fu? Didn't you see how much they were suffering?" Fu just shook her head slowly with her face remaining blank and unfeeling, at least outwardly. "I did, but giving children money that they would just spend on food would merely prolong their lives, not truly help them." Again, Shizuku just looked at the girl in disbelief. "How could you be so cruel? Even if it only prolongs things, it might see them through to the end of this war." Fu simply shook her head in that same slow, thoughtful manner. "Not cruel, simply realistic. And what do you expect Naruto to do? Go through every town, handing out money to everybody and anybody that needs it? Inflation would go up, currency would be devalued, goods would become even harder to purchase, and ultimately the situation would become worse for everybody." Even though her words were cold and logical, there was a hint of remorse in her voice. She didn't particularly like having to be the voice of reason in a mostly emotion-driven group. "Then what do you suggest we do?" "Nothing." Fu sighed, her head tilting down slightly as she walked. "In the end this war will stop, one side or the other winning. The country will slowly recover and things will return to some modicum of normalcy. It is a cycle that has repeated through history. You cannot buy the outcome ahead of time." Neither girl noticed Naruto's hand tighten around his shakuja slightly at that, his knuckles becoming white. "But what about the people suffering in the meantime?" At that Fu could only sigh. War was not a good thing for anybody involved. regardless of whether you were a part of the conflict or not. They will struggle through. Shizuko just frowned deeply, turning to her blonde friend who had stayed silent through the small debate. Come on Naruto, what happened to offering what little help we can? Naruto finally looked up, his face surprisingly weary and saddened, surprising Shizuko when she compared it to his usual calm, but generally happy persona. Unfortunately, Fu is right. It would be pointless if we simply do more harm than good. Shizuku, instead of looking annoyed or angry, simply looked frustrated, her footsteps becoming heavier as they walked. Then what can we do? I want to help those people. Naruto just sighed as he thought back to one of Chikaku's many pearls of wisdom. It is more important to help people to help themselves, otherwise they will simply end up in the same situation again. That's why it's better to teach a man to fish than just give him a fish. His words were only half-hearted though. Like Shizuku, he wanted to follow his heart and help as many people as he could. However, he also couldn't deny Fu's hard logic, her reasoning and arguments were sound. It was like having the proverbial devil and angel on his shoulders, except neither was wrong in their own way. Okay, then how do we do that? At this point Shizuku was becoming desperate. It felt like her friends were ganging up on her, like she was the only one who really wanted to help. Of course, Fu and Naruto both wanted to help, but their emotions were tempered with training, or in Naruto's case meditation, and many shogi matches with Chiriko that taught him to think before acting. The best way would be to deal with the root of the problem. It was Fu's voice that cut through the new tense silence that had pervaded for a few moments. Shizuku just looked up, confused. She was trying to figure out what the problem was. The war. Naruto's voice came out slightly harsh. Naturally, as a monkey abhorred violence, but wars were the worst end of that spectrum. There were no winners in wars, only survivors and the greedy people at the top who profited off of others' pain loss. So, we should join a side of the war and help try to end it. Naruto just shook his head slowly, as did Fu, confusing the young Violet even further. It's not that simple, Shizuku. The girl just threw her hands up into the air, growling out her frustrations. Then what? Why can't you give me a straight answer? Is that too dash? She was cut off suddenly by a huge explosion that rocked the ground underneath them. They only stayed up by fixing themselves to the floor with chakra on instinct and reflex. All three heads swiveled in an instant in the direction of the deafening noise before they all took off in that same direction. A relatively short sprint later the three emerged into a clearing, although it didn't look like it had been that way more than a few hours ago. Burning stumps were all that remained of the trees that had once occupied this area of the forest. The floor was lined with craters and scorch marks, evidence of fire and lightning ninjutsu being used. Worst of all though were the dead bodies scattered around, all of whom appeared to be ninja from their attire, or what was left of it. However, their bodies were mutilated, some missing limbs of heads, others were too burned or charred to be even recognizable. Shizuku immediately wretched at the sight. She had never seen something so horrific that it could have come straight from her nightmares. Naruto on the other hand was reminded of when he first awakened his Rinnegan, the memory of that crater he awoke in with the two mangled bodies that had once been Uchiha. Of course, this was on a much larger and worse scale. With his eyes roaming the recently created clearing, he was able to see the lingering chakra that was used in the obviously rather brief fight. More eye-catching though was one particular source of chakra that wasn't fading, or at least not as quickly. There's a survivor. He was already moving before his first syllable came from his mouth, leaping over downed or charred trees to land in front of a small pile of bodies. He looked away briefly, sickened by the smell of burnt flesh and blood that permeated the air. He shook himself out of it though, grabbing a charred body and hauling it to the side while trying not to look at the melted face of what had once been a man. He quickly repeated the process 3 more times until he finally uncovered the person who was still alive. Erg. She was barely conscious, a young woman maybe 3 or 4 years older than he was with burnt orange hair that was taking on a more literal sense considering the ends of her hair were slightly singed. She shifted slightly as the cold air hit her, blinking her eyes open blearily only to wince from her injuries. Naruto quickly pulled the last body off of her, another young woman who didn't get off with just singes to her hair. Stay awake, you need to stay awake. The woman's head was starting to fall limply to the side and Naruto didn't want to risk shaking her and aggravate any injuries she might have. He wasn't sure if she heard him, but she looked to be at least making a conscious effort to keep her eyes open. Naruto took that as a good sign as he unsealed a small roll of linen bandages he always had on hand for emergencies. He was lucky he hadn't had to use them before now. Gently he lifted the woman's hand, doing his best to ignore her wince of pain as he uncovered a large wound on her side that she had been covering. It was bleeding steadily and while Naruto didn't know much about medicine, he knew that she would most likely bleed out in a few minutes if he didn't stop that. Unfortunately, her light gray flak jacket was in the way so Naruto just acted on instinct, applying a light layer of wind chakra to his palm and slicing straight through the restrictive vest. The navy undershirt she wore beneath that quickly followed as Naruto uncovered the woman's pale skin. Luckily, she wore bandage wraps around her chest. Not that Naruto would have been distracted in such a life-threatening situation, but it helped. As best he could, Naruto began quickly and tightly wrapping the soft white bandages around her torso, making sure they would tight enough to stop the bleeding. It was a temporary measure at best, but it would hold the woman over at least until she could get proper medical attention. Who are you? The woman spoke up in a meek voice as soon as he was finished binding the wound, which thankfully wasn't as deep as he had first thought due to her flak jacket lessened the damage. Just a traveler, now you should keep quiet and conserve your strength if you can. Is there anywhere nearby we can take you to be treated properly? At best these bandages will only last you an hour. The woman nodded slowly, the action obviously bringing her a lot of pain as her hand instinctively sought out her side. She had a few more injuries obviously, but none that were immediately life-threatening. It's alright, don't move. Naruto raised a hand and the ground around the kunoichi softened immediately before rising up into the air like a floating bed. Once Naruto made sure the woman was secure on her sand stretcher, he got her to point out the direction. If the woman was surprised by the strange ability, she didn't show it. Right now, she was struggling just to keep her eyes open. Of course, they had barely taken 2 steps before 3 men suddenly flickered into the clearing, all of them in Kiri shinobi attire. Sorry kids, we can't let you leave here, especially not with that bloodline scum you're helping. Naruto's eyes narrowed slightly at the men. Or at least they would have if they weren't already narrowed to stop people seeing his eyes. Are you the ones who did this? He motioned in a sweeping gesture to the destroyed clearing and numerous bodies littering the ground. The man at the front of the opposing trio just chuckled harshly, a snide grin stretching across his face. Nah, we're just the cleanup crew sent to deal with any stragglers like that bitch you got there. Naruto's lips twisted in disgust as he unconsciously moved his body between the woman and the 3 men. You come and kill weakened or dying men and women like carrion birds. That's disgraceful. The lead man, who appeared to be the shinobi's spokesperson, just sneered, his patience already having worn out. We don't need a lecture on ethics from some punk kid, especially when you speak like those things are human. Naruto glared at the man for that. It was xenophobia like this that perpetuated so much hatred in the first place. Maybe you do need a lecture, you're obviously ignorant. At that the man's patience, as thin as it already was, completely snapped. Like I'll take that from some punk-ass kid barely into his teens. He quickly tossed a handful of kunai at the blonde, expecting him to simply fall over dead from the speeding projectiles. To his surprise though, the flying weapons merely halted dead in midair, as if they had hit some invisible wall. They clattered to the ground uselessly. Not a moment later, Naruto's gaze turning cold as he raised a hand. The ground around the men's feet suddenly burst upward, already turning to sand as it enclosed around 2 of them. The first man though was fast enough to realize what was happening and jumped up and away from the ground in time, the sand that would have been his prison closing in on thin air. The Kiri shinobi caught his breath in a tree at the edge of the recently made clearing, not having expected any kind of retaliation like that, despite the blonde's strange headband. Who are you? Naruto just remained quiet as his hand twisted, sand rising up from the floor and lashing out at the shinobi like long tentacles of some unspeakable creature. Naruto lacked the same inherent control Gaara had due to only recently gaining his sand abilities, but his movements were still deft and swift from practice. Unfortunately, the man was obviously a jounin and was able to avoid most of the dangerous earthen whips. Seeing that he wasn't going to get the situation under control like this, and knowing that Yagura would want to hear of this, the man made to leave. Banzhou Tenin. Unfortunately for him, Naruto predicted his movements, snagging him out of the air where he couldn't dodge or maneuver. Suddenly the Kiri shinobi was flying towards the blonde, his movement out of his control for the moment. Of course, he was still a jounin, one hardened by war no less, and quickly managed to turn the situation to his advantage. He managed to twist his body, pulling the tanto on his back out of its sheath and aiming to take the blonde's head off. Naruto's eyes widened marginally as he cancelled his technique, diving to the side to avoid the potentially lethal slash. The man rolled to his feet, turning to finish the job with his blade. Out of the corner of his eye he saw Fu about to capitalize on him, focusing solely on Naruto. However, before anybody could do anything, the man was suddenly sent rocketing back, hit by an explosive and invisible wave of pure gravitational forces. Shinra Tensei. Naruto slowly lowered his hand, stretching his neck from his uncomfortable landing prompted by his need to dodge the flying blade. He carefully peered into the small line of destruction through the trees the jounin's body had created, only to detect no chakra signature. He stretched out his awareness through the ground only to find the same thing: the man was gone. He got away. Fu frowned while Shizuku looked slightly relieved. For a moment there it looked like Naruto was about to lose his head. He needed to be more careful about what he brought closer when using his second Deva Path ability. Quickly though their attention was returned to the woman on the makeshift stretcher, as she moaned in pain, carefully clutching the wound in her side. Without further delay the trio turned quartet set off into the forest, heading in the direction the woman pointed when she was able. Naruto thought it best to bring along the two men he had been able to capture, floating along in similar sand beds, but more restrictive. After about 10 minutes Naruto began to worry that wherever this place was they might not make it in time. However, when he voiced his concerns the woman merely pointed again, obviously straining to do even that much. Luckily his fears were unfounded, as not even a minute later 5 masked figures appeared around the group in various body flickers, all staring at them suspiciously. Nezumiro. One of the shinobi, a woman if the slight curves to her armor didn't lie, rushed forward, quickly checking over the orange-haired woman on the sand bed. One of the males in the group quickly walked over to Naruto, as he could see it was that blonde who was maintaining the floating structure. He also spared a quick glance to the two men held captive in veritable cocoons of sand, obvious loyalists, as he didn't recognize them. What happened? Where did you find this woman? Naruto looked up at the man. He had lank gray hair that was tied back into a short ponytail, and had a simple porcelain mask with slits for eyes and a wave-like red pattern across one side. I found her in a clearing. She had been attacked, and was leading me to where she could find treatment. The man nodded, glancing over to see the woman still painfully holding her side, the bandages now soaked almost completely through by blood. He seemed to think for a moment, as if weighing up various things in his head before nodding once. Are you able to maintain that bed for another 5 minutes? Naruto just nodded. If he needed to he could keep up this sand for another few hours. All right then, follow us, but keep your hands to yourselves. If we see any signs, you might endanger our camp, we will not hesitate to cut you and your companions down. Naruto just nodded quickly, rather anxious to get the woman somewhere with proper medical care. As they walked, he missed the same gray-haired man carefully eyeing him up, glancing between him and his companions. Blonde spiky hair, dressed like a monk, green-haired and purple-haired female companions. He matches the report, but who exactly is he, and how is he able to manipulate sand like that? Chapter 27, Water 3. It was a few days after the incident involving the Kiri shinobi and the rebel forces, and Naruto was currently sitting in a small tent near the center of a large camp. When they had arrived at the rebel camp, Naruto had been surprised when they were allowed in. he thought they would have been forced to leave in case they were spies. Apparently, the captain of the camp, an older man with long dark brown hair named Tsurugi, needed them to stay until his commander came and asked them a few questions. Naturally, Naruto and Shizuku had been worried about this, Fo being her usual self merely stayed impassive. Of course, they were quickly assured that if they meant no ill will towards the rebels, as their rescue of the kunoichi they found had shown, then nothing bad would happen. Of course, that didn't particularly ease their worries. Shinobi weren't known to be the most honest people, even if Naruto found their goals to be honorable. He had found out this was one of the many hidden camps scattered through the contested regions of Mizu no Kuni, and that there were even some deep within Kiri-controlled territories. Of course, he wasn't foolish enough to ask where these other camps was, that would be far too suspicious, although that didn't mean he wasn't curious. He presumed the camps themselves were hidden by a combination of various genjutsu, traps and the mists, which seemed to work to both sides' favor and disadvantage. Technically the group was being held captive by the rebels, but it wasn't all bad. They weren't treated poorly, although the shinobi obviously came first. It had also been a prime opportunity to talk to various shinobi, especially about water jutsu and affinities. Shizuku especially loved the extra help from shinobi, who were happy to help a young girl with something as mundane as a water affinity. Naruto figured it was a good escape from the fighting. It made sense that training affinities would remind the older and more veteran shinobi of their youth, back before all the war and bloodshed. Under their guidance, Shizuku had made leaps and bounds with the second stage, creating a whirlpool with nothing but manipulation of water chakra. Naruto had also begun to practice his own water technique, once again noting that it felt easier somehow with each passing element he mastered. He wondered if by isolating and controlling each of his various affinities it made it simpler to access the rest. It made sense when he thought about it. He smiled at the thought, remembering his original goal of understanding chakra so long ago. It had now been almost a year and 3 months since leaving the Fire Temple. Naruto was 12, and had been for 2 months. That much was for certain, just as it was obvious to everybody else. Decembers were viciously cold in Mizu no Kuni, especially to those that weren't natives. Luckily, the further they moved south the milder the climate became, but that didn't stop the thin layers of frost that covered the ground each morning. The torrential and perpetual rain wasn't helping all that much either, which was why Naruto smiled as Shizuka ducked under the flap of the tent. "Hey Naruto, you wanted to see me, right?" The blonde just nodded cheerfully as he stood up from his meditative position on the ground. He had tried speaking to his tenants again only to find Matatabi asleep, something he found she did quite often, Shikaku his usual psychotic self, and the Kyuubi being even more stubborn than usual. "Yeah, come on, I want to try something." He quickly ducked under the flap of the tent with Shizuka hot on his heels, the both of them ignoring the rain falling around them. Shizuka practically lived in it anyway, and Naruto had gotten used to it after all his time traveling with her. It was just one of those things you learn to live with, at least, before now. "Come on Naruto, where are you taking me?" The blonde had a cheeky smile on his face, but didn't answer, instead taking Shizuka's hand in his own and carrying on. The violet just looked at his larger hand, smiling nervously as she felt his warmth flow into her from the contact. She had to refrain from giggling like a schoolgirl as the young monk led her through the camp to a small area near the outer edge where she had been training in her water affinity. There was a small stream that ended in a pond which made it perfect for her, and the space was large and open for practicing jutsu. Naruto simply cast a keen gaze around the clearing. It would suit his needs perfectly. There were various seals set up around both the perimeter of the clearing and the camp itself to stop any usage of chakra being detected by loyalists. It allowed the rebels to practice and hone their skills in preparation for conflicts in safety. "Alright, this should do." Shizuku just laughed playfully as they stopped, noticing with a raised eyebrow Naruto had not let go of her hand, not that she was going to inform him. With some trepidation and a flutter of anxiety she noticed they were all alone. The training ground was conspicuously empty. "Come on Naruto, should do for what?" Naruto just grinned again, making Shizuka's heart do a double take for a second time. "Simple, we're going to stop it from raining." Shizuka blinked once, then twice, then she just looked at Naruto strangely for a moment. Didn't you already do that with your gravity abilities? Naruto just shook his head, that same infectious grin splitting his face. Nah, that's too easy. As if to make his point, he raised a hand and suddenly Shizuka felt very odd, like there was nothing holding her down on the ground anymore. She had to anchor herself with chakra, or she felt as though she would simply float away. More incredibly though, the rain around them had stopped falling, the drops just hung in the air like little spherical pieces of glass held up by invisible strings. The purple-haired girl just looked around in wonder at the impossible scene, smiling uncontrollably as she saw the world distorted through 1,000 drops of water. Of course, it had to come to an end as Naruto lowered his arm and allowed the rain to fall once more. Wow. Still, Naruto's grin didn't dissipate. If anything, it grew stronger seeing Shizuka's odd and genuinely happy smile. That's nothing, you're going to stop it entirely. Shizuka just looked around at the blonde. She was obviously skeptical, but after that miraculous event she was slightly more inclined to believe him. How? Naruto just smiled as he took her other hand, causing the girl to blush as red steadily overtook her naturally pale skin tone. He sat down, pulling Shizuka with him until they were sat opposite one another, Shizuka with her legs folded beneath her and Naruto in his classic meditative position. He smiled gently at her, reaffirming his grip on her hands before looking up at the sky, uncaring of the droplets of water pattering on his face. Focus, Shizuku, I want you to treat this like a normal water chakra exercise. The violet just looked at Naruto strangely, wondering just what he was planning, and why he needed to hold her hand to do it, not that she was complaining. Reach out with your chakra, feel it jumping between every drop of rain and push it back. Shizuka frowned but complied all the same, closing her eyes and imagining just what Naruto had described. She used the droplets of water on her face as a medium, breathing deeply as she pushed her chakra outwards, shifting its nature to water once it left her body. She kept pushing, feeling as her chakra leapt from individual droplets around her in a small sphere of influence about 5 feet wide. Around there she began to struggle, beads of sweat joining the rain on her forehead as her hands trembled slightly from the exertion. She opened her eyes, amazed as she saw the rain around her lightening up while outside her little bubble it was still just as heavy. I can't do any more. Her voice was slightly strained from the stress she was putting into the strange exercise. However, she immediately felt Naruto tighten his grip on her hands, the warmth of his skin relaxing her slightly. It's alright, don't give up. Shizuka nodded determinedly, pouring all the chakra she could into holding off the rain around her. She nearly jolted off the floor when a massive influx of chakra suddenly raced through her body. She was suddenly full of energy again, like a fire had been lit deep within her. When she opened her eyes again, she only saw Naruto's smiling face. She realized with a start she was using his chakra, the thought bringing a smile to her face as well as a rosy blush to her cheeks when she realized a bit of Naruto was inside of her. It was an incredible feeling. Compared to her own reserves, the chakra running through her body felt practically unlimited, like she could use as much as she needed and never feel tired. It was like seeing the ocean for the first time, struggling to comprehend just how vast it was as it stretched out into the horizon. She pushed out again, exerting her control over the new source of chakra and practically bathing the area around them in pure water-natured chakra. The next time she opened her eyes it had stopped raining completely. She couldn't even see the edge of whatever clearing they had made in the downpour. We did it. Her voice was quiet, as if she still didn't quite believe what she was saying. Her eyes were roaming the area in shock and awe. Suddenly she shot to her feet, throwing her hands up and crying out in joy. We did it. Naruto got to his feet more sedately, smiling as Shizuka just laughed up at the sky, sometimes pointing as if in defiance. It was the first time in her life she had been underneath the clouds, and it had not rained on her. Suddenly her head shot around at Naruto, her eyes fixed on him as her features were locked in an ecstatic grin. Oof. He was suddenly knocked to the ground as Shizuka practically tackled him, something she was beginning to have a knack for much to his chagrin. She wrapped her arms around him tightly, laughing and grinning, obviously trying to crush Naruto to death from the grip she had in him. After a moment or two she settled for just setting her face against his chest and quietly mumbling thank you over and over. When she finally sat back, now straddling Naruto in a rather awkward manner, she still had that same grin in her face, which slowly faded as she noticed the way Naruto was looking at her. Naruto? He was staring up at her, eyes opened and smile gone. It was replaced by a look she had never seen in him before and couldn't place. What she didn't know was that Naruto was simply transfixed by the sight before him. Shizuku for once wasn't wearing her Miko outfit. She had to wash them at some point after all. Instead, she had a tight navy shirt and simply black leggings that did nothing to hide her developing body, especially as they were both soaked through from the rain before and the clothes were clinging to her frame. Naruto? He never stopped looking at her as he leaned up, propping himself up on his elbows as Shizuka suddenly found their faces only a few inches apart. For a moment she was captivated by his eyes, the same eyes that had always held her attention. She felt as though she could be hypnotized by the swirling concentric circles. She almost flinched as Naruto raised a hand to wipe off a single drop of rain that was clinging to her cheek, snapping her out of her chance. Naruto? Her voice was quiet, barely a whisper as the blonde moved closer, and she found herself mirroring the action. Soon their noses were touching, their breath coming in faster as they found both their heart rates quickening. Then, just like that, their lips met. However, unlike last time, this kiss was anything but chaste. Naruto found his hand naturally moving to the back of Shizuku's head, trying to deepen the intimate contact while Shizuka placed her hands on Naruto's cheeks. When they finally parted, their breathing was even more ragged and small smiles played across their faces. Then, like any good thing, they went back for more. They had to wait a whole other day before the commander finally turned up, a tall man with spiked-up blue hair in the shape of a shark's fin. He wore a battle kimono, the standard attire of a Kiri hunter nin, as well as an eye patch over his right eye. He met Naruto outside of the command tent for the small camp, the only place Naruto and his friends had not been allowed access to besides the armory. Although he did get a glimpse inside when the man came out, managing to spot a table filled with maps and little icons representing troops and bases. He couldn't help but imagine that standing over a table with nothing but a two-dimensional map and some plastic figurines, it would be easy to forget that they represent real people. It was like some large game of shogi, but instead of small pieces of labeled wood, it was living, breathing humans who could really die. He shook himself of the thoughts, leaving the strategizing to the rebels as he looked up at the much taller shinobi. So, you're the kid the reports were talking about? Naruto was slightly unnerved by the man's piercing gaze. Even with only one eye, it seemed as though he could see right through the blonde. I heard you had some interesting abilities. Naruto said nothing, just returning the man's cool gaze with his own calm mask. What's your name? Naruto smiled slightly wider but answered all the same. Naruto Uzumaki. The man's eyebrow rose slightly, but he didn't comment. He unknowingly shared thoughts that Naruto himself had a few times. Ayo? At that, Naruto raised an eyebrow. Before in the camp there had basically been a policy of not telling him or his friends any of the shinobi's names. He had only learned the captain's name from overhearing it when a shinobi had given a report. Ayo noticed the look and just grimaced slightly, crossing his arms over his chest. Trust me, kid, telling you my name means nothing. I'm known to the loyalists by description anyway, so there's little you can do with it. Naruto just nodded quickly. It wasn't like he was going to report this place to the loyalists. I'm gonna get straight to the point, Gaki. What are your intentions? Naruto just raised a hand disarmingly. He had left his shikuju in the tent the three had been sleeping in. I'm just a traveling monk. I had heard of the situation Mizu no Kuni was in and wanted to see if there was anything I could do to help. Ayo just grunted at that. It wasn't a total lie, just as it wasn't completely the truth. It wasn't like Naruto was going to admit he was running away from Kumobakure Shinobi for stealing one of their most prized artifacts. Trust me, kid, you should just leave while you can. A few people have tried the same thing you have, and have either gone home with a couple scratches or not at all. That was something else Naruto already knew, but he just inclined his head politely all the same. I think me and my companions will stay for a while longer, there are still things we wish to do in the area. Ao narrowed his eye slightly while frowning at what he thought was another stubborn kid who didn't know any better. I don't think you understand, kid. From the reports, one of the shinobi you encountered got away. He will most likely have reported to Yagura, or one of his superiors by now. That puts you and your friends in danger. Naruto simply smiled softly, surprising Ao with how calm he seemed to be despite the obvious danger to his life. I wouldn't worry about me or my friends, Ao-san, we're perfectly capable of defending ourselves. Again, Ao merely frowned. He already knew that to some degree thanks to the very detailed reports he had to go through. Even in a civil war, nobody of a high-ranking position was safe from paperwork. Yes, the sand ability you were seen using. Naruto simply smiled and waved his hand, a small pillar of earth rising up and deconstructing into the element he was now so adept at wielding. Ao stared at the small construct before Naruto allowed it to drop, peering at it as if he could see through it. An interesting ability, combined with your large chakra reserves, and you could be quite powerful as a shinobi. Naruto just smiled again, having no intention of ever becoming a shinobi. I didn't take you for a censor. Ao just grunted as a response, something Naruto was relatively used to from his talks with his tenant, and knew to mean mind your own business. Anyway, kid, word of advice, when we finally let you leave the base, start heading either out of the country, or at the very least east. The fighting's not as bad out there, and you should lay low for a while until Yagura's interest in you decreases. He's not somebody you want as an enemy, ask any of the rebels here, he alone has killed more of us than any other loyalist. Naruto just nodded again in thanks for the advice, before pausing in thought. When you finally let us leave? Ao just nodded, his interest in the conversation already waning. He had more important things to do, like fight a war. Our camps shift positions occasionally, you'll be allowed to leave when this one moves. We obviously can't let you just leave knowing the position of one of our forward bases. Ao didn't even wait to see if Naruto understood or not, he just gave a curt wave of his hand and ducked under the flaps into the command tent. He couldn't help shake the feeling that this wasn't the last time he would be seeing Naruto. It was finally the day that the three were allowed to leave. The camp was abuzz with activity as people went about their business. Tents were being disassembled all around them, rations and supplies being stored into scrolls for transport, and the equipment was being distributed to spread the load when they moved. Naruto was currently ducking around people carrying large poles and pieces of tent to get to the medical tent, the last that would be pulled down. He had visited the woman he rescued, Nezumiro, a few times during their stay with the rebels. However, she was mostly too tired or weak to hold any length of conversation. However, today she had been cleared to leave her bed and start on some light exercises to get her body back on the track to recovery. Unfortunately, in war people weren't too picky about their soldiers, regardless of injury. If they could fight, then they were given a weapon and told to fight, for whatever cause that particular side thought was just right. Of course, there were those who genuinely believed in their cause, which was good of course, but ultimately, they were names on a list. Where exactly that list was got decided at the end of the war. He ducked into the small tent, noting that it was conspicuously absent of people save for one shinobi guard, probably a chunin, and the 3 or 4 patients lying on beds. Medical shinobi were a rare commodity even in peacetime, there were none at this camp. He understood that most of the care or treatment was done by civilian doctors who were brave enough to enter the front lines. He thought they were brave as ultimately medics were the main targets for enemies due to their ability to keep shinobi going for longer. Hi Naruto. The woman waved at him with a weak smile. The two had gotten along well once she was informed Naruto was the one who saved her. He had been right, had the woman not received the basic first aid he had given her, she would have bled out minutes after he found her. Luckily the girl hadn't sworn her undying fealty to Naruto or something like that. The blonde wasn't sure how he would have felt with yet another girl in their group. The situation with Shizuka was getting complicated enough as it was. Hey Nezumiro. He waved back at her with a smile as the orange-haired girl sat up in the bed, wincing only a little from her injury which had gotten substantially better after proper treatment. She wouldn't be able to fight for a few months, but she at least wouldn't be permanently crippled, or worse dead. "Hey, take it easy." The girl just chuckled as she scooted back in the bed so she could lean against the wall of the tent. "Ha, that's a funny thing to say to a kunoichi, Naruto. We don't know how to take it easy." The blonde just sighed with a small smile. From the interaction he had with the girl, he was able to tell she was very passionate in everything she did. Be it training, her family, or even her pride over the rebellion, Nezumiro never did anything by the half measure. "So, we're leaving today. Have you thought about what I said some more?" Naruto's reply was a sad smile to which the older girl simply nodded in understanding. During their talks, Nezumiro had accidentally caught a glimpse of Naruto's eyes. Thankfully, she was grateful enough to him not to tell anybody else. However, it had managed to spark her into asking why he didn't join the rebellion with them when he too had a bloodline trait. Of course, Naruto had been adamant that he could not condone or take part in violence except in self-defense. It was enough to say Nezumiro had been very active in trying to persuade Naruto to help. She had seen some of what he could do in the clearing and thought he would be a great help in the fight. "I understand your reasons, Naruto, but what we're doing is for the good of the entire country. Mizu no Kuni can never heal from the massacres if Yagura stays Mizukage. If you help us, I'm sure we can bring him down even faster." Naruto smiled lightly. He suspected if the girl wasn't injured and had the entire right side of her body bandaged, she would be gesticulating wildly as she talked. "I think you overestimate me slightly, Nezumiro." The girl just shook her head fiercely, wincing from the action with a small grimace. "No way. I bet if you and my Aunt May teamed up you could easily take down the Mizukage." Naruto chuckled. He had heard a lot about Nezumiro's aunt, the leader of the bloodline rebellion Mai Terumi. From what he had heard, she was incredibly powerful, able to utilize 2 elemental bloodline limits in combat. He had also gathered that she was remarkably beautiful, but that was more from some of the lewd comment he had heard being made by the male shinobi around the camp. "I'm just a monk, Nezumiro." The girl simply snorted at that, looking straight into Naruto's currently narrowed eyes. "Yeah, a monk with a legendary doge dash." She was cut off as Naruto threw a hand over her mouth, the rest coming out as muffled and indignant protests. "SHH, I don't want people to find out. I've already told you that." The girl simply stared at him with large eyes, unable to talk until Naruto removed his hand. "But why not? You'd get loads of respect and people in the rebellion would look up to you with such a powerful bloodline." This time her voice was quieter, a visible effort on her part to do so as she was mindful of the others in the room. "Exactly, I would have all that attention on me. People might come after me hoping to fight me, or to somehow use me or my eyes to their ends. It would put myself, but more importantly my friends, in danger until I am strong enough to defend us." Nezumiro simply pouted, her arms crossing underneath her chest in a very distracting manner. "But you're plenty strong." Naruto just smiled softly, patting the girl on the shoulder. "Not strong enough." The orange-haired girl simply maintained her pout, not understanding why her new friend wouldn't use his abilities to help the rebellion. "But when is strong enough?" At that, Naruto's smile saddened slightly. "Hopefully, I will never have to find out." With that, Fu came into the tent to tell him they were finally being allowed to leave the camp before going back out to find Shizuku. Naruto turned to a now confused Nezumiro, the girl looking at the hand he had on her shoulder. "I guess this is goodbye then, Nezumiro." The girl seemed to shake her head on her confusion, smiling brightly up at the blonde. He should have known nothing could dampen the vibrant girl's spirits for too long. "Nah, we'll see each other again, I know it. I still have to introduce you to Aunt May. She'll be able to convince you, I just know it." Naruto just smiled again, patting her once on the shoulder before turning and leaving the tent. Nezumiro never lost her confident smile as she settled back down on the medical bed. The trio were back on the road again, or more correctly they were back in the forest, blindly heading east as they had been advised. Now that both Naruto and Shizuku had the means to complete their water exercises, there was no longer any reason for them to go to Kirigakure. There was also the small fact that Kiri was on complete lockdown. Nobody went in or out without being thoroughly searched. Without proper identification, it was unlikely they would get close, and even if they did, if Naruto's eyes were seen, they would instantly be arrested, or at least they would attempt to arrest them. Naruto wasn't exactly sure what to do next. Technically, there was nothing really for them to do in Mizu no Kuni, except Naruto still felt as though he had a purpose here. It was like there's still something he had to do, but he hadn't quite found out what yet. Nezumiro's words still rang in his head. He kept wondering if it was wrong to turn down the offer to join the rebellion. It went against his peaceful views, yet at the same time he couldn't deny what Yagura was doing was just wrong. Unfortunately, he was hardly a politician, not that there hadn't been attempts at negotiation. Yagura had apparently been unwilling to listen to any of the bloodline clans, and anybody who argued in their defense was simply labeled as traitors to the village and to the country. It had gotten to the point where the water daimyo had to flee the country for his own safety, leaving it squarely in the control of the shinobi village. It had basically been martial law until the rebellion began. They passed through a few more towns and villages on their journey east, each bore the scars of war. Whether it was people on the streets, the increased rebel or loyalist presence, the general air of fear, or the hopelessness hanging over the people, the war seemed to be taking its toll on everybody. It actually made Naruto fear what he might find if he went further south. Eventually, though, they reached the eastern coast of Mizu no Kuni's main island, and Naruto still hadn't come up with their next move. However, looking out over the sea, a bright golden beach beneath them at the bottom of the cliffs they were standing on, he could almost forget the war-torn country behind him, almost. He sighed wearily. They'd had a long journey and each of them was tired. Some relaxation would probably do them some good. The veritable beach of sand made it very easy for Naruto to set up a quick hut, getting them out of the sudden sun that had emerged from the clouds. Shizuku beamed at the sight. She had never thought she would ever get to enjoy a beach in the sunlight and only wished she had a bathing suit. Wow, this place is beautiful. Naruto couldn't help but agree with Shizuku's declaration. He just wished the rest of the country could be as calm and tranquil as this single stretch of sea and sand. It certainly lives up to the portrayal in books. Naruto was rather surprised to hear some actual emotion in Fu's voice. She sounded genuinely pleased at the sight, which in turn raised his own spirits. I guess we earned a day off. Through their travels east, Naruto had worked on his Banbutsu Suzu almost religiously, handing off any food he made to people as he passed. He figured it wasn't like money. He was simply feeding people like he would anyway had he the supplies to spare. Luckily, he managed to fix the issue with the taste, otherwise he might have been doing more harm than good. Anyway, the things he made had to go somewhere. He found that when he made food he couldn't simply convert it back into the black dust. It seemed fixed as whatever he had created. Suddenly the quiet, serene atmosphere was disturbed by a strangely loud bird call. Naruto looked up into the relatively clear sky but didn't see anything. However, not even moments later the same call cried out, even closer that time. Deciding to ignore the annoying bird, Naruto turned his attention to the sea. Besides bounding between Kaminari no Kuni and Mizu no Kuni, he never had the opportunity to actually enjoy the ocean before. Naruto! Shizuku's scream of surprise jolted him into action, turning his head this way and that to see where she was. However, to his horror, the girl was high up in the air, tightly bound in the talons of an enormous eagle that was flying out to sea. She was out of range of his Banzō Tenin before he could even blink. Quickly getting a grip after the strange sight, he took off after the girl, only for the large bird to fly even faster, quickly fading into the distance. He heard his name briefly on the wind before he lost sight of the girl and the bird altogether. Shizuku. Chapter 28, Water 4. Shizuku. Getting over his shock, Naruto immediately raced forward, running out onto the surprisingly calm ocean waters. However, the bird was very fast. He had already lost sight of it by the time Fu caught up to him. Damn it! He quickly molded his chakra, about to summon something that would let him catch up to her when he felt a hand quickly grab onto his arm, stopping him from slamming it down. Naruto! The blonde rounded on Fo angrily, surprising his fellow Jinchuriki by the determination in his eyes. What Fo? We don't have time right now. The girl held his gaze for a moment, her grip on his arm tightening slightly when he went to pull away and complete the technique. Calm down, Naruto, you have to think. Fo knew this would be difficult for the monk. He was very emotion-driven, and when he got carried away, he tended to act without thinking first, especially when it came to his friends in trouble. Of course, there was also the fact that with every second they wasted, Shizuku was being carried further and further away to who knows where. But Naruto was about to argue, but something in Fo's hardened orange eyes made him falter. Relenting for the moment, he stood up straight and took a deep breath, calming his worry and anger. He nearly slapped himself for being so stupid when he realized what he could do instead of going after Shizuku. Damn, I could just summon her back. Fo smiled, a relieved sigh leaving her as she stepped back on the water. She was glad Naruto wasn't too taken by his emotions. Kochios. Naruto was feeling a little sheepish. He had gotten so carried away over such a simple problem, at least until the smoke from his technique cleared to reveal nothing. What the hell? At this, Naruto began to panic again. There was no way the bird could have possibly gotten outside of his range yet. Hell, he didn't even know he had a range for summoning. He hated to think it, but even if Shizuku had been killed, he should have still been able to summon her body. What's wrong? Naruto just turned to Fo helplessly. He didn't know why his animal path suddenly wasn't working. It had never happened before. I don't know, something's blocking my ability to summon Shizuku. Fo frowned at that. It meant they would have to go after her after all. The only problem was they had no idea where the giant eagle, that now she thought about it had to be a summon itself, had gone. Naruto seemed to share her thoughts as he immediately slammed his hands back down again, pouring in more chakra this time. Kochios. Again, the smoke cleared only to reveal nothing, the chakra Naruto had used rushing back into him from the failed summoning. Damn it, we'll have to go after her. This time when he slammed his hand down, the ceiling matrix spread out as it should have, encompassing a large area of the water they were standing on. Kochios. A large squawk sounded through the area as the smoke this time parted to reveal that same large drill-beaked bird Naruto had summoned in Kaminari no Kuni. Get on! Both quickly jumped up on the bird's back, the creature seemingly paying them no mind as they grabbed onto the spike sticking out of its neck. With barely a thought from the blonde, the bird pushed its enormous wings down, lifting them into the air at an astonishing rate. Naruto had considered trying to summon the bird that had taken Shizuku, but he wasn't sure what would happen then, if Shizuku would be brought with it or not. He didn't want to risk Shizuku being dropped into the ocean from such a height. Chakra training or not, that would surely kill her, or at least injure her enough to make her be paralyzed and drown. Without any clear destination, Naruto had the giant summon fly in the direction they had seen the eagle go, northeast out to sea. As the minutes trickled by and they continued to see nothing, both Naruto and Fo grew more worried for their friend, Fo hiding it better behind her expressionless mask. Finally though, when they had begun to enter a slightly more turbulent and stormy area of the sea, Fo spotted something. Over there! Naruto nearly fell off his summon as he turned so suddenly, peering out in the direction Fo pointed. His superior eyes easily made out the small dot of an island a few miles away. It was the only lead they had, so Naruto steered his summon in that direction. As they grew closer, they soon saw the island wasn't as small as they had originally thought. It looked around 2 miles wide with a volcanic-looking mountain to one side mostly shrouded in thick forests. The two shared a look as they approached the out-of-the-way island, nodding to one another. If the eagle took her to its nest, it'll be high up on the mountain somewhere, and if it returned to its summoner, the most secure location will be inside the mountain anyway. Naruto just nodded. He had similar thoughts and quickly directed the bird towards the mountain. As they passed over the shore of the island, Naruto began to look out for any kind of structure beneath them that would give them an idea of where Shizuku might have been taken. Unfortunately, he was looking off the wrong side of the bird and missed the sudden attack. Look out! Luckily Fu was vigilant enough, but still wasn't able to react in time to stop the long golden chains that suddenly appeared around the summon. In seconds it had been ensnared, the movement of its wings suddenly halted, making its trajectory suddenly plummet. More surprisingly though, what Naruto had at first mistaken for long golden chains actually appeared to be glowing golden symbols, threaded together like a rope. Soon they tightened too much and the summon was forced to dismiss itself, suddenly leaving Naruto and Fu in midair. Fu. Naruto tried to reach out a hand to grab his mint-haired friend, but they were already too far apart and falling too quickly. Turning his attention to his own plummet, he missed as a cloak of red chakra suddenly ignited around the girl, wings spreading out and quickly halting her fall. Naruto wasn't so lucky, as unfortunately reducing gravity's effects on him would do nothing while he was already falling, and he had only seconds before he would hit the ground, not enough time to summon again. It left him with only one choice as he neared the dangerously approaching earth. Shinra Tensei. A few feet of the ground, Naruto braced himself, firing out a wave of gravitational forces he hoped would be enough to halt his downwards momentum. Unfortunately, it only slowed him down. He still hit the ground with enough force to create a small crater. If his body had not subconsciously reinforced itself with chakra, he would have surely broken more than a few bones. As it was, he found himself lying in the ground, groaning in pain as he felt his consciousness drift away. The last thing he saw was a flash of red hair before his eyes closed. Fu drifted to a gentle stop on the ground in the nearest clearing she could spot. She had lost sight of Naruto when he fell. She thought he was somewhere to the east of her. Quickly she allowed her bijou cloak to drop, shuddering as she felt the vile chakra retreat back into the seal over her left breast, right above her heart. She still despised using that chakra. She wanted to be strong by herself, not by borrowed power. She only used it as a last resort, or when there was no other option, like when she needed to fly. And that had definitely been a time she needed to fly. She was beating herself up a little as the potent chakra fully receded. If only she had acted quicker. If she had noticed faster, she might have been able to fly after Shizuku before it was too late, but she had hesitated out of shock. If she had only noticed the strange golden chain sooner, she might have been able to warn Naruto in time for him to deal with it. She cursed her own inability to protect her friends, and now she was out here in the forest, all alone, not knowing if they were safe or not. Pulling herself out of her own pity, she quickly ran off in the direction she thought Naruto had landed, knowing he would have come up with something to at least cushion his fall. He was just resourceful like that. She probably wouldn't admit it, but Fu really looked up to Naruto. Apart from the fact he saved her, he was also strong. He was the first person to ever defeat her, even if it was only sparring, and he did so without any borrowed power. While she conceded his Rinnegan gave him certain advantages, she admitted that was the same for any bloodline. It was the fact Naruto never used his own Jujutsu arrogantly, or to the extremes, only when it was necessary, and even then, in moderation. In a way Fu was a little envious that he could use his Jujutsu, making him less reliant on the bijou inside of him. She was shaken from her thoughts as she entered a small clearing with a roughly human-sized crater. Unfortunately for her, it was empty. Frowning, the girl looked around, knowing that if Naruto had stayed conscious through an impact like that, which was doubtful given the speed he must have hit to make a crater like that, then he couldn't have gone too far. She crouched down, touching the floor gently as she pulsed out some chakra through the earth. Soon enough a few insects gathered around her, feeding her information in their unique non-verbal way that she could only understand thanks to her tenant. It was another unwanted, but undeniably useful gift her status as the Jinchuriki of the Nanabi gave her. However, she became worried when the insects informed her somebody had been here, but they had been taken away by a different chakra source. She quickly picked up their trail, dashing off as fast as she could, only hoping that she wasn't too late once again. However, before she got too far her danger senses kicked in, allowing her to throw herself to one side in time to avoid the attack of some large animal. When she jumped to her feet from her roll and turned, she was surprised to find a giant centipede staring straight at her, its mandibles clicking ominously. Fo remained quiet as the human and creature stared the other down, wondering all the while why she couldn't communicate with this particular insect. With a start she realized it was a summon, too late to capitalize on that fact before the giant bug launched forward, obviously intent on bisecting her with its sharpened mandibles, dripping with an indeterminable fluid. However, even as she dived out of the way of the linear attack, the mint-haired girl was running through hand seals, finishing as she got back to her feet. Takigakiryo, Mizukiri no Yaiba. Before she was even finished speaking, a long blade of water materialized in her hand, drawing from the moisture in the air, and from the water in Fu's body. She crouched into a careful stance, eyeing the centipede for any more signs of an attack. The creature didn't disappoint as it lunged forward again, obviously not the most intelligent summon with such predictable and repeated attacks. This time though Fu was ready, as the clicking mandibles came closer, she sent chakra to her legs, allowing her to jump up and over the insect. The massive arthropod tried to follow her with its head and adjust its attack, but it was already too late. Fu slashed down, cleanly slicing through the insect's head and continuing with the cut as she fell, neatly bisecting the entire creature down the length. When she landed in a crouch, she cancelled her technique inside, standing as the summoned animal slowly split apart, falling to the floor before vanishing in a brief cloud of smoke back to its own realm. Fu was about to take off again when a decidedly angry hissing noise caught her attention. When she looked around, she was greeted to the sight of an enormous snake, its scales a mottled and pale green. It hung from one of the larger trees in the area as its dull yellow eyes stared at her intently. Fu could only sigh as the water-cutting sword once more grew from her hand, and she settled back into her stance. How inconvenient. When Naruto woke up, he put a hand on his forehead, groaning slightly from the intense headache he had. From the light streaming through the windows of wherever he was, he estimated it had only been around an hour since he had fallen unconscious. Speaking of which, he looked around, noticing he was in some kind of bedroom. The walls were stone, but were painted a warm red. It was fairly Spartan in all, only the bed he was lying on and a desk in the corner providing furniture. He swung his legs off the bed at the same moment somebody walked through the door. "Oh, you're up already." Naruto just blinked at the girl who had walked in. He was rather surprised to see she had a look of genuine concern on her face as she hurried over. She had long red hair, tied up in two bangs at the front by a simple white headband. She wore a rather ornate blue and yellow kimono-styles dress that ended in a short skirt. Most strange though was the long translucent ribbon that streamed behind her like two tails, that and the fact she was barefoot. Where am I?" The girl just fumbled her hands over one another, looking oddly nervous for some reason before finally hanging her head, ashamed. "I'm really sorry. When I saw the bird flying overhead, I thought you were an enemy, and Matsumoto-sensei told me that if I saw anybody like that, I was supposed to capture them." She looked up, her arms waving in front of her desperately. "But I didn't mean for you to fall like that. My technique is only supposed to be used to bind things." Again, she looked down, obviously upset with herself for nearly hurting somebody. It's okay, nobody got hurt after all." Suddenly though his eyes widened as he looked around. "Wait. Where's Fu?" The girl just looked at him, obviously confused. "Sorry, I only found you. If your friend also fell, then they're somewhere out in the forest." Naruto immediately got to his feet, already making for the door when he felt a hand grip his arm. "Wait. You can't go out there. The summoned animals will attack anybody they don't recognize." Naruto paused, looking around at the girl who was looking fearful for his safety, odd considering she was the person who made him fall in the first place. "All the more reason to go find my friend. If she's hurt out there, then she could be in trouble." He was about to break away from the girl and leave when he stopped, once again nearly slapping himself for his idiocy. The redhead simply watched in confusion as Naruto took a breath before slamming his palm into the wooden floor of her room. "Kuchiyose." The girl watched the seal matrix spread out, which she instantly recognized as a summoning contract seal, before the room was bathed in white smoke. "Naruto, I was wondering when you might summon me." Naruto had the decency to look slightly sheepish as Fu gave him a blank look. "Give me a break, I've been unconscious for how long?" Fu blinked once before allowing the water blade that had been in her hand to disperse, annoying the red-haired girl seeing as it got water all over her floor. 32 minutes. At that Naruto blinked, she had counted? Whoa, how did you summon a human? Both Naruto and Fu turned to look at the girl who seemed to have gotten over her annoyance at her floor being soaked in favor of staring at Naruto in awe. The blonde just chuckled and rubbed the back of his head as Fu looked around their surroundings to see where she had ended up. "It's just an ability of mine." The girl just nodded dumbly, still obviously amazed by the unique ability that theoretically shouldn't be possible. Summoning was a very complex contract between a human and a summoning creature that allowed them the use of a space-time ninjutsu briefly. To manipulate it to apply to another human, even just one, was unheard of. The only thing that would come close to it was a reverse summon, but clearly that was not what she had just seen. Suddenly realizing she had been gawking at the pair, she straightened up. "I'm Anoka, by the way." Naruto smiled pleasantly, glad the conversation was moving away from his abilities. This is Fu and I'm Naruto Uzumaki, he didn't get a chance to say any more as suddenly Anoka was across the room, looking at him much too close for his comfort. "Did you say Uzumaki?" Naruto just nodded warily, unprepared for when Anoka suddenly screamed out in excitement, tackling the blonde to the ground. "I can't believe it. I thought I was the last one." She sat back, uncaring of the fact she was straddling Naruto rather intimately, a beaming grin in her face. "I'm Anoka Uzumaki." Naruto's eyes just widened in surprise before his expression became saddened, confusing Anoka. "I think there's been a misconception." The redhead just blinked in surprise as she got up off of Naruto, staring at him anxiously. "Listen, I'm an orphan, I'm pretty sure the name was only given to me at random. I don't think I'm a genetic Uzumaki, otherwise somebody would have told me by now. I don't have the red hair, or purple eyes." By now Anoka was shaking her head in denial, she had finally found some family, and he was saying it wasn't actually true. "No. But you don't know for sure, right?" Naruto just shrugged sadly, he couldn't think why the Hokage would ever keep the fact he had a family, even if they were now mostly wiped out, from him. "Well, I don't believe you." Her face suddenly brightened, even if it looked a little forced on her part. "The way I see it, you're practically family." She beamed at him, making Naruto give her a meek smile back. The whole situation was rather awkward for him. For the longest time in his young life he had wanted what all the other kids had: family, parents, somebody to go back to at the end of the day who would love him. However, now that he might have found it, it was tainted by the nagging doubt that it might not be real, that he might not be a true Uzumaki. A part of him desperately wanted to ignore that, to just take happiness in the moment, but he also couldn't do that to Anoka, it would just be fake. Luckily the girl finally seemed to snap out of her family-crazed stupor, looking at him more intently. "Either way, Matsumoto-sensei will want to speak to you. We're researching summoning animals here, and that ability of yours might help his research." While interested in the fact the people here were looking into summoning and summoning animals, Naruto had to quickly raise his hands in protest. "Look, we only came here because our friend was kidnapped by a giant eagle, we wanted to get her back." Anoka's eyes widened at that and she nodded quickly in understanding. "Well, that's perfect. Matsumoto-sensei's summoning contract is with the eagles, so he'll be able to tell you where your friend is." While Naruto was somewhat relieved to hear that, he was rather cautious about meeting these people. After all, they were conducting experiments on summoning animals, essentially weapons for shinobi, on an isolated island just off of a warring nation's coast. To him that sounded like a military operation, and he couldn't be sure if these people were working with the rebels, or the loyalists, or if they were some kind of independent faction. "Well, all right." Anoka just grinned in a way Naruto found oddly familiar, but couldn't quite place, while Fu just looked between the two, wondering if they were in fact family. The redhead happily led them out of her room, making quick progress through the forest towards wherever it was she was taking them. All the while Naruto couldn't help but worry about Shizuku. she had been separated from them for a long time now. Catching his worry, Anoka sent him a disarming smile. I wouldn't worry about your friend, the eagles are a very noble summon. They would never harm anybody unless they were asked to by their summoner, and Matsumoto-sensei would never do that. Naruto returned the smile, but he wasn't so sure about the girl's sentiment. Either way, it only went a small difference in easing his worry. Alright, we're here. The redhead gestured to the door set into the mountainside. It was just a simple wooden door, there was nothing all that ominous about it. However, once she led them through the passageway behind it, the space opened out into what Naruto could only assume was the crater of the mountain. Although he would have to correct himself, as it was clearly a volcano given the large lake of molten lava bubbling away at the bottom of a wide shaft they were navigating around. Anoka saw their surprised looks and giggled to herself. It was the same when she had first seen the lava. Matsumoto-sensei is really smart, he uses the natural heat from the volcano to power the machinery. The molten metal inside the lava also disrupts chakra sensing techniques, making the facility very hard to locate by normal means. Naruto just nodded, still looking into the bubbling molten rock below them with curiosity. Finally, they reached the facility itself, built into the volcano on the other side of the crater, where a young man was seemingly waiting for them. Anoka. Where have you been? Matsumoto-sensei has been waiting for you. The initial stage of the experiment is beginning. The redhead's eyes widened slightly beneath one of her stray bangs, looking up in shock at the young man in a lab coat. Already? I thought it wasn't for a few more days. The young man quickly shook his head. Come on, he has been searching for you the last few hours. Yagura-sama wanted the experiment accelerated, so Matsumoto-sensei had to bring it forward. The girl nodded quickly, worry evident on her features. On the other hand, Naruto nearly froze in place, as did Fu. They now had confirmation these people were working with the loyalists, or at least Yagura. He now had to continue very carefully so he didn't reveal anything about himself to these people. Wait, I have to talk to him first, something has come up. She tried to motion to Naruto, but the young man seemingly ran out of patience, taking her arm and leading her into the base, all but ignoring Naruto and Fu in his haste. Having nothing else to do, and knowing this was their only current option to get Shizuka back unharmed, Naruto followed them into the facility. He was surprised by the inside, it was like nothing he had ever seen before. The floor was all bleached white tiles while the walls were carved from the surrounding volcano, giving the whole place a very secret base feel to it. Scientists were scurrying about from various workstations and consoles, some moving around on the catwalks suspended from the ceiling that all surrounded the center of the room. That seemed to be the center of it all, an enormous rectangular metal tank that Naruto couldn't see into from his angle. Almost as soon as they entered, Anoka was approached by an older man with receding gray hair and an impatient look on his face. Anoka, it's good you're finally here, the procedure can begin now. He quickly took her hand and was about to lead her away, but the girl wrenched her hand out of his grasp, much to the man's obvious surprise. Wait, Matsumoto-sensei, there's somebody you have to meet. The man took a look behind the girl, his eyes glancing over Naruto and Fu with a great deal of suspicion before dismissing them completely. No time, Anoka, we have to begin the procedure. Seeing that this man was the holder of the Eagle contract, Naruto was about to step forward, but Anoka beat him to it. You don't understand, sensei, Naruto has the ability to summon humans. Suddenly the older man paused, his eyes flitting back to the blonde where they lingered, now decidedly more interested by the young monk. He seemed to have an internal debate with himself before stepping over to Naruto and looking down at the boy. Well, if what Anoka says is true, you and I will have much to talk about later, Naruto-san. Unfortunately, right now I am very busy. You should stay and watch, what we are about to do will go down in history. He turned back to the red-haired girl, and looked like he was about to walk off again before Naruto stepped forward. Wait, Matsumoto-san, I understand you hold the Eagle contract. A friend on mine was taken by what I think was one of your summons. We came here to retrieve her. I would be happy to answer any question you may have, but could you please return her to us? The man turned slowly, observing Naruto for a moment, obviously displeased he was being held up so much from the procedure. He just sighed. In his opinion, the chance to talk to somebody able to break one of the very boundaries of summoning was well worth the small inconvenience. Very well. He ran through a small string of hand seals, his chakra moving in ways Naruto was intimately familiar with. Kochios. He slammed his hands down, and when the smoke cleared, many of the scientists looked up in surprise at the large eagle suddenly crouching in the middle of the room. More important to Naruto, though, was the young purple-haired girl hanging onto its leg, shivering slightly. Shizuku. Naruto happily ran forward, grabbing the girl into a tight hug, as the eagle disappeared behind them, obviously confused with the strange location of its summon. Naruto. The girl seemed confused and disoriented, no doubt from going through yet another summoning, this time not even from Naruto. 1 second I was up in the sky, circling some island, the next. She suddenly tilted forward slightly, her face gaining an unhealthy shade of green as she looked about ready to heave her lunch. By now Matsumoto had grown tired of the reunion, now much more focused with getting on with the experiment. Very well, now that is taken care of, Anoka. This time the girl just nodded complacently, following after the older man to a ring of seals on the ground, where she crouched down and began to channel her chakra. You should watch this, young Naruto. What we are about to do is create the ultimate summoning animal. Begin the revival process. Naruto was surprised by the man's words, wondering just what he meant by that as he watched on in interest. The scientists that were at their various workstations all started to carefully watch various monitors as the liquid in the tank began to glow with a faint green light. Matsumoto merely smiled as the various machines in the room hummed with power, electricity beginning to spark around the tank. A gray tentacle suddenly sprouted from the liquid, splashing the area around it with the viscous substance before being joined by more. Test successful, Matsumoto-sensei. The creature is conscious and chakra flow is positive. The balding man just nodded to the scientist who had called out, motioning to the red head near him. Excellent. Excellent, the test was a success. You can begin to suppress it now, Anoka. The Uzumaki girl nodded with a smile before her face twisted into a look of intense concentration. To Naruto's surprise, the very same lines of golden symbols that had attacked him before seemingly peeled from the floor. Like chains controlled by some invisible puppeteer that lashed forward, intent on surrounding and suppressing the creature that had emerged from the tank. It mostly looked like an oversized maggot with large squinted eyes and an open, toothless mouth that seemed trapped in a perpetual yawn. It had a few tentacles emerging from its body at random that seemed to try and fight off the golden chains that quickly wrapped around the beast, holding it onto the ground. Seemingly everything was proceeding as it should. The beast was subdued and was slowly being forced back into its tank. However, suddenly a look of discomfort appeared on Anoka's face. At the same moment, one of the beast's tentacles broke free from its shackles. Something's wrong. One scientist on the catwalks cried out, panicking slightly as the readings on his monitor fluctuated. The creature has more chakra than we anticipated. We have to abort before it breaks loose. This time it was a woman who shouted, her screen displaying similar results. Matsumoto seemed momentarily shocked before his features hardened. Anoka, can you restrain it? The red head looked up, sweat beginning to gather at her brow as she focused intently on the ceiling. I am trying. However, Naruto could clearly see what was going on. The beast was slowly absorbing the chakra from Anoka's ceiling chains, weakening them and strengthening itself. Stop. It's absorbing the chakra from the seals. You have to stop now. Matsumoto turned to the blonde with a sneer, irritated by the interruption to what was supposed to be his masterpiece. Quiet boy. Boy, you don't understand anything. Anoka is an Uzumaki, they can seal anything. However, as if just to prove him wrong, another tentacle broke loose, flailing madly above the catwalks, much to some of the scientists' concern. Anoka too winced in pain, her control over the technique slipping as she felt her chakra diminish at an alarming rate. I can't hold it. To emphasize that point, one of the beast's tentacles suddenly wrapped around a scientist who couldn't avoid it in time, instantly pulling him down, and to the shock of everybody there, absorbing him into its body. There was a moment of pause before all hell broke loose. The 4 remaining scientists all began to run towards the exit to get away from the creature, while Anoka's control finally broke, releasing the beast. Naruto could only watch on in horror as 2 more scientists were succinctly captured and absorbed into the beast. Before it could grab any more, it was suddenly hurled back by an unseen wave of force. When the remaining scientists and Matsumoto looked around, they saw Naruto with his arm raised, Rinnegan eyes blazing angrily. "If you won't stop this, then I will." Chapter 29, Water V. Matsumoto stared at Naruto in horror before his gaze drifted back to the creature, still collapsed over on the other end of the room, a crater in the wall marking where it impacted. Naruto was about to walk forward and finish the creature when Matsumoto ran out in front of him, arms spread out wide as if blocking the blonde's way. "What are you doing, Matsumoto? Didn't you see what that thing did to those scientists? We need to do something before it's too late." The graying man just shook his head firmly, his knees shaking slightly from seeing his coworkers die as well as the power Naruto had displayed. "Why you can't?" Some steel seemed to return to the man's eyes as he straightened up, his stance growing more rigid. Even so, Naruto could tell that while he may have received enough training in chakra to summon, the man had no experience in taijutsu. "It's my life's work. Everything I've ever done has been for this. If you destroy it, my life will have been a waste. We need to simply contain it, not kill it." Behind him the maggot-esque creature stirred, almost languidly getting back up using its many tentacles as supports. "Move aside, Matsumoto. Now." The man stood firm though, even as the creature looked around, its insectoid compound eyes focusing on the balding man. Naruto made to use his Shikuju to incapacitate the scientist for now, only to realize it wasn't in his hand. With some shock he realized that it must still be in Anoka's room. He never took it with him. In his moment of hesitation, one of the creature's tentacles lashed forward, intent on snaring Matsumoto, no doubt so he could join his coworkers. Banzhou Tenin. Just before it could snag the man, he was pulled forward by some invisible force, the tentacle closing on nothing but air. Naruto quickly caught the man, pushing him to one side before they could both be crushed as yet another tendril slammed down where they had been moments before. The creature let out a loud and high-pitched shriek at its targets getting away, its large eyes glaring intently at the blonde. "Shinra Tensei." Naruto raised both hands this time, wanting to make sure the creature didn't get back up from this hit. However, even as the invisible wave of gravitational forces slammed into the beast, its eyes briefly began to glow an ominous red. Naruto could only blink in surprise when the creature didn't even budge from its position. He watched as the chakra was merely absorbed by the beast instead of impacting with it like it should have. Well, that's not good. He dived out of the way again as another of the creature's tentacles tried to crush him mercilessly. He rolled to the side, near where Matsumoto was now propping himself up against a desk, panting heavily. That won't work. The creature was designed to absorb chakra from ninjutsu. Naruto glared at the man, grimacing to himself. That was a lot like his Preta path, and would certainly make things difficult, especially without his Shikuju. "Is there anything else you can tell me about it that will allow me to defeat it?" The graying man just looked up at him hopelessly, obviously having an internal struggle on whether or not to help Naruto. On one hand, the chances of them making it out of here alive were growing increasingly slim. On the other hand, he couldn't bear to see his life's work be destroyed only minutes after he had finished it. "You can't destroy it. Please?" By now the man just sounded desperate, making Naruto turn away in disgust. He couldn't stand that this man would allow innocent people to die just to save an experiment. Unfortunately, any more thoughts were interrupted by Naruto having to jump out of the way of another attack. "Damn, I need to do something about those tentacles." He sprinted across the room, ducking and weaved between various gray tendrils the creature kept sending after him, obviously identifying him as the main threat. However, before Naruto could come up with a plan, he saw a green blur race past. A moment later the creature let out a deafening shriek as one of its many tentacles suddenly fell from its body, green liquid spurting from the wound. Need help? Fu landed next to him a second later, two long swords made of water held in each hand as she glared at the creature. Naruto merely smiled at her as he began to think about what he could do. If I can hold it still, do you think you could deal with the tentacles? Fu narrowed her eyes at the creature, which was now staring at her intently with murderous blood-red eyes. She nodded once, settling into her stance as she avoided a barrage of crushing attacks from the beast, slicing away at its flesh when she could. Naruto just watched her before nodding and channeling his chakra quickly, hoping to deal with the creature's many limbs all at once. Kuchios. When the smoke cleared, the creature looked around, staring at the new arrival with hunger. Naruto ignored that as he jumped up atop the enormous octopus he had summoned, the Rinnegan eyes it had telling him it was not a real summon. From the corner of the room Matsumoto stared up at the enormous invertebrate with awe. He had never heard of an octopus contract. Get ready, Fu. Without so much as a word the octopus moved forward with surprising speed for a creature so far out of its element. A moment later the beast suddenly found all its tentacles ensnared by the limbs of Naruto's octopus, the suction cups keeping a very tight grip. Knowing that was her signal, Fu dashed forward, nothing more than a blur to most in the room. In seconds it appeared to be over. Fu skidded to a stop, her water-cutting swords falling uselessly to the ground as the jutsu ended. When he looked back there was a moment of pause before the creature once more let out a terrible shriek of pain. As all its tentacles slid off of its body, the limbs spurting green blood up into the air as they thrashed about. However, before anybody could capitalize on the creature's sudden disadvantage, a new tentacle that had been hidden behind its body suddenly whipped out, faster than the others. In only mere moments it had wrapped around the body of the octopus, and slowly began to reel the giant cephalopod towards it. Naruto had to jump back as his summon was immediately absorbed into the beast, as if it had never been there in the first place. I told you, nothing will work against it. Naruto had landed near to where Matsumoto was cowering behind a desk on the far side of the lab from the creature. It has the ability to absorb other summons to expand its abilities and grow stronger. Naruto simply stared at the man in a mixture of frustration and disbelief. He wondered what had possessed him to make a creature this difficult to control. Naruto. The blonde swiveled on one foot to see an enormous tentacle, thicker than the ones before, about to slam down on his body. Thinking on the fly, he suddenly blasted away into the air, one arm looped around the doctor's waist, as he used a quick Shinra Tensei to get him away. Milliseconds later the clean white tiles were smashed into shards as the thick limb crashed down on the floor, leaving a long and deep imprint. When the blonde looked at the beast, it had regrown all of its tentacles, except they were longer and thicker now, each having a single row of suction cups running their length. He set Matsumoto down on one of the higher catwalks, hoping the man would be safe here, although the chances were looking increasingly grim. Ninjutsu and his techniques using chakra were useless. His summons only made the beast stronger, and if he got close enough to use taijutsu he would most likely get absorbed. He had no intention of finding out which of their abilities to absorb chakra was stronger. Damn it! How do I beat this thing? He looked to Matsumoto again, but the man was no use. He was just staring down at the maggot-like beast with wide eyes, shivering occasionally. Before he could think of anything though, his eyes widened in surprise. Below them Anoka had run forward, already flashing through a long chain of hand seals. When she got close enough, she crouched down, slamming her hands onto the floor as an enormous sealing matrix spread out. Anoka! What are you doing? The girl just ignored Naruto as the long lengths of ink-black sealing symbols began to peel off of the floor, shooting out like chains. The beast struggled beneath the bright lines of light, but slowly began to be pushed to the floor. However, its eyes once again flashed that ominous red. The change was obvious as Anoka grunted from the exertion, sweat beginning to gather on her brow. Please? Do something quickly. I can't hold it for very long. The redhead's cry broke him from his surprised stupor as he vaulted the catwalk, dashing across the ground as a long black chakra rod slid from his sleeve. He wasn't sure if this would work, but he didn't want to give up an opportunity like this. Apparently Fu had shared his thoughts as she too sprinted towards the beast, water-cutting blades once again extended from her hands. They moved past one another before moving towards their targets, Fu jumping up into the air. Naruto ran to the nearest tentacle, slamming his chakra rod down into the tip, driving both it and the limb into the floor. As soon as he did, he rolled over the tendril, another chakra rod already slipping from his other sleeve. As soon as he reached the next one, Hao repeated the process, driving the sturdy rod straight into the beast's flesh and ignoring its pained cries. As a monkey hated seeing any creature, even one created for the sole purpose of killing, hurt in any way, however, he would never allow this thing to escape uncontrolled. Takigakure Kakuchu. As Fu descended from her jump, the two swords in her hands suddenly grew outwards, extending past their previous limits. With a cry, the mint-haired girl brought them down, slamming both into the creature's head all the way up to her hands. She stood there on the beast's bulbous head for a moment, panting slightly as she maintained the chakra-intensive technique for a moment longer, making sure it killed the creature. However, her orange eyes suddenly widened as she felt her chakra ebbing away, flowing out through her swords and into the beast. At the same moment she also felt her feet start to sink. Naruto. The blonde looked up before he could impale the last of the tentacles, seeing Fu slowly being absorbed into the creature. He was about to throw his hand up to draw her back, but the beast used that moment to slam him with its last remaining free limb, sending him flying across the room. He twisted his body before it could impact painfully with a wall, landing feet first, so he could flip back down onto the ground safely. Fu no. Naruto would have attempted to save the girl, but his Banzhou Tenin wasn't that accurate from this distance. Before he could sprint over there to help her though, the same golden tendrils of light suddenly broke away from the creature, freeing it, but at the same time wrapping around just Fu. In a few seconds she was free of the beast as Anoka drew her back, leaving the green-haired girl panting on the floor beside the redhead, her eyes widened in fear. Naruto breathed a sigh of relief before he too opened his eyes in shock. A shadow begun to descend on the two girls as the beast brought a tentacle down in a sweeping motion to crush them both. However, before it could, they suddenly flew backwards, as if yanked back by invisible strings tied around their waists, both crashing into Naruto's opened arms. They lay there on the floor for a moment, Fu and Anoka taking small breathers while Naruto was trapped due to their bodies lying on his arms. Ah, Fu. Anoka? The two girls looked up at his face for a moment before blushing and looking away, quickly scrabbling back to their feet. Naruto got up slightly more slowly, keeping an eye on the beast as it writhed on the floor, obviously in great pain from being impaled through its tentacles and stabbed twice in the head. He was surprised the thing wasn't dead, but then again it had already proved how resilient it was. No doubt it had absorbed a lot of the chakra from Fu's water blades before they could do the damage intended. How do we get rid of this thing? Even as the blonde watched, the beast began using its one free tentacle to slowly draw out each chakra rod from its limbs, shrieking in pain with each one it removed from its flesh. Suddenly they all saw Matsumoto appear from the catwalks, walking slowly towards the beast, Anoka's eyes widening in horror. Matsumoto-sensei! What are you doing? The older man ignored her though, slowly walking towards the beast with his arms opened wide. The creature kept one eye on the man, its free tentacles swaying slowly as it continued to remove the rods from the rest. Yes. That's right. You recognize me, don't you? It's me, your creator, your father. The beast continued to gaze at the man, unmoving for the moment as Naruto, Fu, Anoka, and Shizuku could only watch on, wondering what would happen. Listen to me. You should stand down and return to your tank, that's an order. The beast's head cocked to the side slowly before its gaze drifted across to the metal tank in the center of the room. That's right, listen to my orders as your creator. Slowly the beast's limbs rose into the air, as if in compliance, eliciting a large grin from the aging scientist. Yes, that's Riga. Everybody's eyes widened as Matsumoto suddenly doubled over, spitting up blood from his mouth as he looked down with a shaky head. Protruding from his stomach was a long gray tentacle with a sharpened tip, stained red from the man's blood. He grasped it between his shivering hands before looking up at the creature, his eyes widened in shock that never left his face as he slumped over. Before anybody else could react, his limp body was raised into the air before swiftly being absorbed into the creature. No. Matsumoto-sensei. Anoka was the first to break out of the shocked silence that had enveloped the room, running forward only to be grabbed from behind by Naruto and pulled back. Just in time too, as not a second later one of the tentacles slammed down in front of them, crushing the tiles in the spot Anoka was just in. No. Let me go. Matsumoto-sensei. She struggled against the blonde's firm grip, unable to break away as Naruto suddenly jumped back again, avoiding another attack aimed at the two of them. Anoka, stop it. He landed back down on one of the upper catwalks, closer to the entrance of the facility, holding Anoka back as she struggled against his grip. Let me go, Naruto. I have to stop it. Naruto just kept holding her down, passively using his Preta path to weaken her slightly until she stopped struggling. Below them the creature thrashed about, obviously displeased it had lost its target. In the meantime, Fo had recovered, dashing back in with her water blades in order to sever the beast's tentacles again. Anoka, stop, there's nothing you can do, it will just absorb your seals. Finally, the red-haired girl dropped resisting, falling slack in Naruto's arms as she quietly sobbed. But I have to keep fighting. What about Matsumoto-sensei? She sobbed again, louder this time as she latched onto one of Naruto's arms, pressing it against her chest as tears trickled down her cheeks. Naruto just patted her on the back, knowing what the loss of a loved one felt like as he did his best to comfort her and keep an eye on the creature. You don't have to fight anymore, Anoka, leave it to us. Suddenly the girl bit back her tears, standing up before Naruto could grab her. No. I can't just sit here while that thing runs loose. I need to fight because it's what I believe is right. Before Naruto could stop her, she dived over the edge of the catwalk, rolling to her feet when she hit the floor. She immediately crouched down, speeding through hand seals as fast as she dared, different ones this time. When she slammed her hands down that time, another sealing matrix spread out. However, when the symbols peeled from the floor, they were a deep red, almost as if they were set aflame. As Fu darted and weaved between the various tentacles, slicing and cutting any exposed flesh she could while keeping out of the beast's reach, Anoka's seals rushed forward. However, instead of suppressing the beast like before, the new seals seemingly seared straight into the creature's flesh, leaving deep black marks on its skin. Like before, the beast shrieked in pain, glaring at the two girls as its eyes glowed red in anger as it thrashed about. However, like before, it eventually became too much. The creature just had too many limbs, and in the end it simply forced them back or threatened to crush them. Fo panted from her position, the water blade in her hand finally bursting back into its harmless element. She suddenly straightened up, her fists clenched in anger, as an oppressive aura suddenly spread out across the room. Everybody looked to the girl as virulent red chakra gradually spread across her body like a cloak, two crisp, insectoid wings rising from her lower back out of the corrosive shroud. Faster than most could see, she darted forward, fist cocked back as she approached the beast. She ducked underneath one of its tentacles, intent on swatting her away like a fly, although flew past it would be more accurate. Her vibrant chakra wings beat incredibly quickly, creating a slightly hum as she skimmed across the floor. Finally, she reached the beast, slamming her fist right into one of its eyes with a sickening squelch. Time seemed to slow a little as his fist sunk into the creature's vulnerable eye, the beast crying out in agonizing pain, raising a tentacle to strike her. However, Fo moved out of the way, allowing the beast to slam itself over the head with its own limb. However, in its anger it lashed out with all of its tentacles at once, now furiously mad at the floating Fo. The girl was fast, but not enough to avoid all of the tendrils at once. One long tentacle wrapped around her body at the waist, squeezing her tightly. She tried to smash her fist into it, hoping to get the beast to let her go, but it had the opposite effect, crushing her even tighter as it coiled. She grunted in pain as she felt her bones begin to creak, her features twisting into a grimace. Suddenly she gasped as the corrosive chakra around her body slowly began to ebb away, sinking into the beast's tentacle as its remaining eye glowed. As the vile but protective shroud began to dissipate, the beast squeezed even harder, slowly drawing the girl towards its body. However, before it could begin to absorb her, everybody suddenly saw a streak of black fly across the room. With another sickening cry, the creature dropped full roughly to the ground, its tentacle waving madly in the air, allowing everybody to see the long black rod impaled all the way through. Banzhou Tenin. A moment later, and Fu was safely in Naruto's arms, being gently laid on the floor to one side. They had a brief moment of respite as the beast thrashed about, mourning the loss of its eye and trying to lessen the pain in its limbs that were healing at an astonishing rate, no doubt thanks to the enormous amount of chakra it absorbed from Fu. Naruto just frowned, struggling to come up with a way of defeating a creature that could shrug off most attacks. Damn it, chakra-based attacks don't work, we can't get close to it, Bijou chakra is useless and anything I summon just. Suddenly an idea struck Naruto, his eyes widening in surprise at not thinking of it sooner. He suddenly turned around, dashing away from the creature and towards the exit of the facility. However, before he could get far, Fu grabbed his hand, halting him for a moment as she looked up to him. "What are you doing?" Naruto just gave her a small smile, surprising the girl given the serious situation they were in. "It's a summoning animal, right?" Fu just nodded in confusion as Naruto grinned and sped off again, sprinting as fast as he could towards the exit of the facility. He raced past Shizuku and Anoka, the two girls giving him matching looks of confusion that he ignored. Finally, he reached the outside, skidding to a stop at the edge of the ledge that dropped down into the boiling lake of lava beneath them. The blonde stopped, turning back to look into the lab where he could see the murderous red eyes of the beast staring straight back at him. He merely answered with a grim smile. "Kochios." He slammed his hand down into the ground, right at the edge of the cliff, so that the ceiling matrix actually spread out into thin air. He leapt back as the area erupted in a cloud of smoke, only to clear and reveal the beast itself. Its red compound eyes whitened slightly as it suddenly found itself outside, balanced precariously over the ledge. It tried to slam one of its tentacles down on the ground as an anchor, but Naruto saw what it was doing. "Oh no, you don't." The blonde leapt forward, stabbing a chakra rod straight into the tentacle before it could get a proper grip. The creature shrieked in pain as it let go, its remaining eye widening as it suddenly fell backwards, unable to balance any longer. Naruto didn't walk forward to look down, he didn't want to see what was happening. The horrifying cries of pain and anguish were bad enough to listen to as the beast slowly melted to death in the molten rock. He nearly jumped when he felt a hand on his shoulder. He looked around to see Anoka staring towards the ledge. "Are you okay?" Anoka just nodded sadly, dried tears staining her face as she sniffed back more. Naruto just gave her a weak smile before patting her on the shoulder and walking past to see if Fu and Shizuku were okay. The four young preteens were back in Anoka's room, Naruto thankfully reunited with his Shikuju. He had been surprised to find that Anoka had actually carried it with her when she found him in the forest, which led him to believe she had a surprising amount of chakra. He briefly wondered if that was an inherent Uzumaki trait, a question Anoka couldn't answer due to her not knowing her parents. Apparently, Matsumoto had found her in an outlying village in Mizu and Kuni in an orphanage, taking an interest in her due to her name. He took care of her over time, raising her and training her in any Uzumaki techniques he could find. Naruto discovered that the Uzumaki clan were not only famous for their seals, but also incredibly apt in them. Most teenage Uzumaki were able to surpass what passed for a sealing master anywhere else in the elemental nations. It made Naruto wish he had looked at seals more in depth, but at the time he was more interested in finding a way to help Sora, and sealing would have taken too long to learn, and that was gambling on whether or not he was a real Uzumaki. Despite all of Anoka's insistence that she could somehow feel that he was family, Naruto could never quite remove that nagging doubt at the back of his mind, something he may never be able to get over. Now the four were discussing what would happen now the facility was shut down. They had been unable to find the two remaining scientists, who had run off when the creature first started absorbing their coworkers. Anoka didn't really know any of them too well, only having proper contact with Matsumoto, but she worried for them anyway. The forest was now a dangerous place with all the summons running about without any contract holders to direct them. This point brought Naruto onto something that had been bothering the blonde for a while now. Anoka, you've been researching summons for a while now, right? The redhead nodded from her position sitting cross-legged on her bed. Shizuku was in a chair on the other end of the room, while Naruto was leaning against the girl's desk, Shikuju safely in hand. Fu was more content to simply lean up against the wall, quite close to the door in case they had to leave quickly. It was a remnant of her conditioning in Taki she hadn't been able to break. Do you have any idea why I was unable to summon Shizuku when she was being taken away by the giant eagle? The red-haired Uzumaki blinked before looking up thoughtfully, the question interesting her due to her inherited interest with all things to do with summoning she had gained from Matsumoto. I'm not sure, I would have to know more about your ability. Naruto just nodded, giving the girl a rundown of what he could do and had done with his animal path up until then. As he continued to explain, the awed and fascinated look on Anoka's face only grew. At one point she rushed over to her desk and grabbed a notebook, quickly scribbling down what Naruto was saying. When he was done, the girl simply stared at her notes and thought for a while, going over everything in her head. Well, I can only give you a hypothesis until I could get more data, but the only reason I could see would be because of Matsumoto-sensei. The girl's voice was quiet at the end as her head tilted down mournfully. Naruto thought she somehow blamed herself for her mentor and father figure's death. However, when she looked up and saw all of their confused faces, she cleared her throat and wiped away the tears percolating at the edge of her vision. I think because Matsumoto-sensei still held a viable contract with the Eagles, you were unable to summon them, and by extension anything connected to them at the time. It must mean that you are unable to summon animals with a pre-existing contract with humans. Naruto frowned at that. The logic was sound after all, and it was a good explanation, but there was a problem. But I can summon the chameleons, they're an actual summon, and they've had a contract with humans before. They told me so. It was Anoka's turn to frown at the new information as she returned to her notes, skimming over them briefly. Are their summoners still alive? Naruto blinked at the question before shaking his head slowly, making Anoka smirk. If there was anything she enjoyed, it was confirming a hypothesis like any good scientist. When a summoner dies, something happens with the contract. Their name remains where they signed it, but it fades slightly, freeing the animals from that summoner, unless they were already called upon before their death. So, if the animal has no living summoner, then you are able to call upon them with your ability. If they do, you cannot. Naruto just looked at the redhead, impressed by how quickly she had gone through all that. Matsumoto-sensei may have been able to tell you more, he was the expert after all. She looked down again, obviously saddened and barely holding back her tears. He would have loved the chance to talk to you, you could have revealed so much about summoning. At that she finally broke down, sobbing quietly to herself on the bed with her hands bunched up into fists. She didn't even look up when Naruto walked over, placing a comforting arm around her shoulders. She simply turned into his chest and cried deeply while Naruto let her, allowing her to cry out all the grief she had bottled up. A day later, and the group were standing on a beach on the west side of the island, the sea breeze making their hair and clothes flutter about. The trio were saying their goodbyes to Anoka, who was tearing up slightly. Shizuku too was saddened. In the time they had spent together, the two girls had become fast friends with a lot to talk about. But in the end, they had to go their separate ways, much to their mutual displeasure. Are you sure you don't want to come with us? There's always room for one more in the group. Anoka just gave the blonde a sad smile as she moved forward and captured him in a hug. Sorry, but this is something I have to do. Matsumoto-sensei always promised that one day he would take me to the ruins of Uzushio. I have to make sure that I see that promise is kept. Are you sure you don't want to come with me? You're family after all. Naruto stepped away from the hug, looking at the shorter girl with melancholy in his eyes. Anoka, we've already talked about this. You know he was cut off as the girl placed a finger against his lips, a light smile running across her features. No matter what you say, Naruto, you're family to me. Blood does not make a family, bonds do. She giggled into her hand as she stepped back, waving to the two other girls who waved back, one with more enthusiasm than the other. Naruto thought it might actually be for the best she didn't join their group. For some reason Fu didn't get along all that well with the red-haired Uzumaki. So I guess I'll see you around Itoko. She gave him a beaming grin that Naruto couldn't help but return with a small smile of his own. Yeah, in any case I want to thank you. Anoka just blinked at that, looking up at the blonde in confusion. Thank me? Naruto just nodded as his smile grew slightly. He looked away for a moment as if remembering a fond memory. You reminded me of something my own sensei once taught me, something I had been ignoring until now. He looked back to the redhead, pulling her into another brief hug, this time annoying both Shizuku and Fu, although the former was still uncertain as to why. He told me that being a pacifist is not about avoiding all conflict, but about knowing how to choose your fights. He pulled away, leaving the Uzumaki with a slight red hue to her cheeks. You reminded me of that, so thank you. He suddenly moved back, molding his chakra as he walked before slamming his hand down. Kochios. When the smoke cleared, Anoka recognized the animal as the same strange bird she had knocked Naruto and Fu off when they had arrived at the island. Wow, I don't think I'll ever get tired of seeing you do that. Naruto just grinned as he hopped up onto the bird, Fu and Shizuku quickly following him, despite the Violet's slight hesitation. As they took off, the bird's strong wings beating downwards to lift them into their air, Anoka waved the group off, however she couldn't help but call to them one more time. What are you going to do now? She saw Naruto's grin as he waved to her even from that distance. What else? I'm going to choose a fight. The redhead just smiled as the group slowly flew off into the distance. When they were finally out of sight, she turned, scratching her head once. Where did they leave the boats again? That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket pass going to the different worlds of anime fanfictions. Looking forward to having you on board again.